Thank you for joining and welcome to this virtual board meeting of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Robert Sumwalt. I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB, and joining us today are my colleagues on the board, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Jennifer Homendy, Member Michael Graham, and Member Tom Chapman. Today we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the midair collision of a de Havilland Beaver and a de Havilland Otter near Ketchikan, Alaska on May the 13th, 2019. Both airplanes were engaged in on-demand sightseeing flights. The pilot of the Otter and none of the Otter's passengers were injured. And tragically, a 10th passenger on board the Otter and the pilot and 4 passengers on board the Beaver lost their lives as a result of the collision. On behalf of all of us at the NTSB, I'd like to offer our sincerest condolences to the family and the friends of those who've been affected by this horrible, horrible tragedy. Please understand that the reason that we are here is to learn from this tragedy so that others don't go through what you're going through. Midair collisions are rare, but as we saw in this crash, they can have catastrophic consequences. Such collisions are rare partly because aviation, unlike surface transportation, occurs in an enormous volume of sky. Miles of separation between the aircraft is the norm, except in high traffic, busy airports come to mind. But such high traffic areas also include high traffic air tour areas, such as the airspace between Ketchikan Harbor and the Misty Fords National Monument, in which this accident occurred. To prevent rare but catastrophic midair collisions, every pilot has the duty to see and avoid other aircraft. Pilots must continuously scan for other aircraft and take action to avoid them. But there are inherent limitations in the see and avoid concept. And in this case, for example, the weather was clear, it was in the middle of the day, and yet the 2 aircraft still collided. The obvious limitations to see and avoid include a pilot's limited field of vision and the fact that a pilot's view can be further obstructed by airplane structures. But there are many other human, visual, and attentional limitations to the see and avoid concept, and I look forward, along with my colleagues, to discussing those issues today. I also look forward to discussing ADSB technology, which can supplement the protection offered by the see and avoid concept. ADSB, as most of us know, stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. Now, ADSB out allows the airplane to broadcast satellite position and velocity to ground stations and to aircraft equipped with ADSB in. Now, ADSB in allows an airplane to receive ADSB messages. Aircraft receiving these messages can display surrounding traffic to the pilot. But as we know, the devil is in the details. If an airplane broadcasts incomplete ADSB messages, traffic alerts about the airplane could be lost. Simply, no matter how complete a traffic picture is available through ADSB out, pilots and aircraft without ADSB in will never see it. Additionally, an airplane's avionics must be capable of displaying an accurate traffic picture and of producing timely visual and oral alerts to draw the pilot's attention to collision threats. Today, we will also discuss the FAA's ADSB requirements. And since both airplanes were equipped with ADSB in and out technology, we will discuss how this layer of protection failed, resulting in the pilots remaining unaware of each other's aircraft, despite the ADSB equipment on board. And finally, this accident will lead us to once again, highlight the subject of safety management systems and why we believe it is so important. Neither company had an SMS at the time of the accident. In fact, at our most recent review, only 20 out of nearly 2,000 Part 135 certificate holders do not have an FAA-accepted SMS. 149 others have applied for FAA acceptance, and I should note that one of the 20 with an accepted SMS is Taquan Air, one of the accident operators, which adopted an SMS post-accident. But if SMS were implemented across the board, accidents such as the one that we will discuss today might be prevented. We've called for the FAA to require and verify SMS in all revenue passenger carrying aviation operations. And this issue is so important that it is on our most wanted list of transportation safety improvements. Now, each board member has studied the draft report, and each of us have met individually with the investigative staff. Today's board meeting, however, is the first time that we, as a deliberative body, will have gathered to discuss the report. Today, the staff will lay out the pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report, and they will present the draft findings, a probable cause, and recommendations to the board. And then we on the board will question the staff to ensure that the report, as we adopt today, truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. The public docket for this investigation contains more than 1,300 pages of additional relevant material, and it's available on our website at www.ntsb.gov. The final report will also be made available on our website in a few weeks once any amendments voted upon today are incorporated and the report is finalized for release. So at this time, I'd like to have each of my colleagues on the board introduce themselves. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleagues and to the staff. I look forward to our meeting here. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Member Havilland.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to my colleagues, and good morning to the staff. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Member Graham.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, fellow board members and staff, I look forward to our deliberations today.
Thank you very much. And Member Chapman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Excellent work by our staff, and I look forward to the discussion today.
I agree. Excellent work by our staff. I'll now ask our Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce the investigative and support staff who will be participating in today's board meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. First, I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this virtual board meeting today happen. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all electronic devices at this time. Now I'll introduce the staff for today's meeting. Unless otherwise noted, the staff is from the Office of Aviation Safety. Dana Schultz, Director for the Office of Aviation Safety. Aaron Sauer, Investigator in Charge. Dr. William Bramble, Human Performance. Steve McGladry, Aircraft Systems. Bryce Banning, Operations. Kathleen Silva, General Counsel for the NTSB. Darlene Hatchett, Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Jim Ritter, Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. John O'Callahan, Aircraft Performance. Chris Babcock, Recorders. Clint Cruikshanks, Airworthiness. Nathan Hoyt, Analyst from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Dr. Michelle Waters, Medical Officer from the Office of Research and Engineering. Jason Fedock, Survival Factors. Josh Lindberg, Airworthiness and Visuals. And Jill Demko, Report Writer. Presentations will begin with an investigative overview by Investigator in Charge Aaron Sauer. Mr. Sauer.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. On May 13th, 2019, about 12:21 Alaska Daylight Time, a float-equipped de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver and a float-equipped de Havilland DHC-3 Otter collided in midair about 8 miles northeast of Ketchikan, Alaska. The Beaver pilot and 4 passengers sustained fatal injuries, and the airplane was destroyed. The Otter pilot sustained minor injuries, 9 passengers sustained serious injuries, and 1 passenger sustained fatal injuries, and the airplane sustained substantial damage. Both airplanes were operating as on-demand Part 135 sightseeing flights to take passengers from the Misty Fjords National Monument to Ketchikan. Before returning, both airplanes were converging on a scenic waterfall near Mahoney Lake when they collided in flight at an altitude of 3,350 feet. Recorded avionics data from the Otter and automatic dependent surveillance broadcast data, or ADSB, for both airplanes show the flight routes. Both flights originated a few minutes apart from Rudyard Bay and proceeded back toward Ketchikan via different routes. The Otter flight path is shown in magenta, and the Beaver flight path is shown in orange. The 2 flight paths converged over George Inlet, where the midair collision occurred. The ADSB data indicated that about 12:19, the Otter started a descent from 4,000 feet, and the Beaver was climbing from 3,175 feet. Over the next 1 minute and 21 seconds, the Otter continued to descend on a southwest track, and the Beaver leveled out about 3,300 feet. The airplanes collided about 12:21. The ADSB data for both airplanes ended about the time of the collision. The Beaver broke up into multiple pieces and impacted the water and terrain northeast of Mahoney Lake. After the collision, the Otter turned about 180 degrees, entered a right wing, nose down attitude toward the water. The Otter impacted the waters of George Inlet along a northeast track. A 2-part animation was created to show the collision in simulated traffic displays. I will now play the first part of the animation that depicts recreated views of the collision from both outside and inside the airplanes. At this time, if you do not wish to view the animation, attendees watching by webcast may wish to step away from their display. I will now play the animation.
About 12:21 Alaska Daylight Time, a float equipped to Havilland DHC-2 Beaver and a float equipped to Havilland DHC-3 Otter collided in midair about 8 miles northeast of Ketchikan, Alaska. The Beaver and the Otter were conducting VFR Part 135 on-demand sightseeing flights. Both airplanes took off from the Misty Fjords National Monument about 30 miles northeast of Ketchikan and were headed to the Mahoney Lakes area near Ketchikan. The Beaver airplane, with a pilot and 4 passengers, departed about 12:02. The Otter airplane, with a pilot and 10 passengers, departed about a minute later. Calculated ground speeds and altitudes for both airplanes are displayed at the lower right, along with a clock that is displayed at the upper right of the animation. The airplanes collided at an altitude of about 3,350 feet near the west side of the George Inlet. Following the collision, the Otter turned about 180 degrees and descended into the waters of the George Inlet. 1 passenger on the Otter sustained fatal injuries. 9 passengers sustained serious injuries, and the pilot sustained minor injuries. The Beaver broke up in flight after the collision, and the debris was scattered over the terrain northeast of Mahoney Lake on the west shore of George Inlet. The pilot and all 4 passengers on board the Beaver sustained fatal injuries. The next series of animations depict the collision from both outside and inside the airplanes. This animation depicts an exterior view of the Otter looking towards the Beaver. The Beaver, in the white circle, becomes visible in the animation about 24 seconds before the collision. This animation depicts the view from the Otter pilot's seat, with cockpit structure obscuring portions of his field of view. About 11 seconds before the collision, our analysis concluded the Beaver would have been obscured behind the Otter's window post. The Otter pilot recalled seeing a flash, seeing white and red, and then a tremendous collision. This animation depicts an exterior view of the Beaver looking towards the Otter. The Otter, in the white circle, becomes visible in the animation about 30 seconds before the collision. Due to the airplane structure and the passenger seated to his right, it is unlikely the Beaver pilot could have seen the Otter prior to the collision. This animation depicts the view from a passenger seat on the right side of the Beaver. As the animation ends, the scene transitions to a photograph captured by a passenger's camera as the airplanes converged. The circle indicates the position of the Otter pilot, showing his view was obscured by the window post. The prevention of midair collisions has traditionally relied on pilots being able to see and avoid other aircraft. In this accident, the Otter pilot's view was obscured by the window post, and the Beaver pilot's view would have been blocked by airplane structure and his right seat passenger.
Before playing the second part of the animation, I'd like to provide an explanation of the ADSB system and the airplane's cockpit displays of traffic information, or CDTI. Both airplanes were equipped with ADSB out and in technology. ADSB uses global navigation satellite system position reports from appropriately equipped aircraft to track aircraft movements. Aircraft determine their own position and altitude from satellite signals. ADSB out equipment then broadcasts the aircraft's position, altitude, and velocity to ADSB in equipped aircraft and to ADSB ground stations at a rate of once per second. The ground stations record and rebroadcast this data along with additional traffic data collected using legacy radar technology. Aircraft equipped with ADSB in can receive this information and display it to the pilot on a CDTI screen, as was done on both airplanes. Depending on the configuration of the transceiver and the CDTI, ADSB in avionics enable aircraft surveillance applications to display traffic and produce visual and oral alerts of predicted collision threats. The slide depicts the Chelton Flight Logic display used on the Otter. The display presents a top-down view of the pilot's airplane and the surrounding airspace. The pilot's airplane, or own ship, is represented by a white airplane symbol in the middle of the display, shown in the red circle. The direction of travel of the own ship is towards the top of the display, shown in the orange circle. The compass heading is indicated by the outer compass rose. The scale of the display is indicated by the range rings. Other aircraft surrounding the own ship are depicted as arrowheads placed at their positions relative to the own ship and pointed in the direction of travel. The relative altitude of a traffic target in hundreds of feet is displayed as a text label below its arrowhead symbol. Traffic targets more than 6 nautical miles away or separated by more than 1,200 feet in altitude are depicted as open, cyan-colored arrowheads. Proximate traffic targets are those within 6 nautical miles and 1,200 feet, as depicted as solid, cyan-colored arrowheads. The slide depicts the ForeFlight application used on the Beaver. The application runs on an Apple iPad and also presents a top-down view of the pilot's airplane and the surrounding airspace. The pilot's airplane, or own ship, is represented by the blue airplane symbol in the middle of the display. Other aircraft surrounding the own ship are depicted as arrowheads placed at their positions relative to the own ship and pointed in the direction of travel. The relative altitude of a traffic target in hundreds of feet is displayed as a text label above its arrowhead symbol. All targets are depicted as solid, cyan-colored arrowheads. The ForeFlight application does not depict proximate targets differently unless they are in alert status. The ForeFlight application will generate visual and oral traffic alerts if the traffic alert setting is enabled when a target approaches within 1.8 nautical miles horizontally and plus or minus 1,200 feet vertically of the own ship. If the traffic target is within those parameters, its symbol will change to a solid yellow-colored arrowhead. The oral alert generated will enunciate the presence of traffic and its relative clock position, distance, and altitude. I will now play an animation that depicts simulations of both airplanes' traffic displays.
The following animations depict simulated cockpit displays of traffic information for both airplanes starting about 4 minutes before the collision. Note that the actual range settings used on the displays during the accident flights are unknown. The displays on both airplanes are driven by ADS-B data. The Beaver pilot had a for-flight application on an Apple iPad display, and the Otter was equipped with a Chelton FlightLogic display. The for-flight application on the Beaver pilot's iPad can provide oral and visual alerts of nearby traffic. However, it requires pressure altitude data from a target aircraft to generate an alert concerning that aircraft. The Otter was not broadcasting pressure altitude because a required piece of equipment was turned off. Consequently, the for-flight application on the Beaver pilot's iPad could not produce an alert concerning the Otter. Additionally, due to the lack of an alerting function contained within the ADS-B-in avionics that process traffic information, the Chelton display was not able to provide oral or visual alerts to draw the pilot's attention to traffic threats. The Otter's Chelton display presents a bird's eye view of the Otter, depicted as an airplane outline in the lower center of the display and the surrounding terrain and air traffic. Other aircraft are depicted as cyan arrowheads pointed in the direction they are flying. The arrowhead, representing the Beaver, appears at the Otter's 10 o'clock position and is filled with color because the Beaver is within a 6 nautical mile horizontal and a 1,200 foot vertical distance from the Otter. More distant aircraft are depicted as outlined, non-filled arrowheads. The numbers next to each arrowhead indicate each aircraft's altitude relative to the Otter in hundreds of feet. The iPad display on the Beaver, running the for-flight application, depicted the Beaver in the center as a blue aircraft silhouette. Other aircraft appear as filled cyan arrowheads, regardless of the distance from the Beaver. The arrowhead representing the Otter appears at the Beaver's 3 to 4 o'clock position with no relative altitude displayed because the Otter was not broadcasting pressure altitude. This simulation presents the oral and visual alerts that could have been generated by the for-flight application if the Otter had been broadcasting pressure altitude.
Traffic, 3 o'clock, 2 miles, 400 feet above.
Although both aircraft were equipped with traffic displays, limitations in the alerting capabilities resulted in neither pilot being alerted to the impending collision. Had these limitations not existed, oral and visual traffic alerts in each airplane would have occurred early enough for the pilots to have taken action to prevent the collision. As shown here, the for-flight application would have generated an alert 1 minute and 44 seconds before the collision. The actual time of an alert on the Chelton display is unknown, but based on similar systems, it is estimated that Chelton would have generated an alert 37.4 seconds before the collision.
After a comprehensive review of the circumstances that led to this accident, the investigation established that the following factors did not contribute to the cause: pilot qualifications, pilot medical conditions, and airplane mechanical malfunction or failure. Safety issues identified in this accident include the inherent limitations of the see and avoid concept, the safety benefits of ADS-B out and in supported traffic advisory systems, the lack of an ADS-B in requirement for Part 135, the absence of visual and oral alerts from the airplane's traffic display systems, the loss of pre-existing oral and visual alerting capability on Capstone program aircraft, and the importance of accurate checklists. Staff has proposed recommendations in these areas and proposes reiterating a safety recommendation for safety management systems for Part 135 operators. Thank you. Dr. Bramble will now continue.
Good morning. I'll discuss the limitations of see and avoid, the benefits of traffic alerting, and implications for high traffic tour areas. Part 91 right-of-way rules state that when weather conditions permit, vigilance shall be maintained by each person operating an aircraft so as to see and avoid other aircraft. This is the primary means of traffic separation when air traffic control is not performing this function. See and avoid has limitations. It can be difficult for pilots to see other airplanes because of collision geometry. Aircraft on a collision course appear very small and lack apparent motion until a collision is imminent. The presence of aircraft structure around the pilot means traffic can only be visually acquired when it is within a cockpit's field of view. Humans have difficulty visually noticing small unmoving objects, especially those located in their periphery, and this task is made more difficult when such objects are superimposed on complex backgrounds. Finally, humans are imperfect at monitoring for infrequent events, especially when they are performing tasks that require divided attention. This is a diagram from staff's visibility study for the Beaver. A translucent blue figure represents the outline of the right front seat passenger. A multicolored line at the top of the passenger's window, near the base of the right wing, shows the position of the Otter in the pilot's field of view for 3 minutes leading to the collision. This diagram indicates that the Beaver pilot's view of the Otter was mostly obscured by the passenger in the wing. This is a diagram from staff's visibility study for the Otter. Again, a multicolored line shows the position of the Beaver in the pilot's field of view for 3 minutes leading to the collision. This diagram indicates that the pilot's view of the Beaver was intermittently obscured by a window post, most critically for about 11 seconds before the collision, when visual detection would normally be most likely. In addition, while the Beaver approached from the left, the Otter pilot was focused on maneuvering toward a waterfall to his right. Last, neither pilot received a traffic alert. The Beaver pilot's for-flight application could display ADSB traffic on a cockpit-mounted iPad shown in this photo. This iPad was destroyed in the crash and its settings could not be retrieved. However, the Otter target would not have been displayed if the iPad was off, the for-flight app was not open, the app's traffic display was not selected, or the app's high distant traffic setting was selected. Even if the Otter target was depicted on the display, the Beaver pilot could have missed seeing it depending on how often he was visually scanning the iPad. The Otter pilot's Chelton EFIS display was on and showing traffic, and staff's analysis indicates that the Beaver would have been depicted as a target. The Otter pilot seems to have missed seeing the Beaver target on the display because he last recalled looking at the display about 4 minutes before the collision. Staff sought to understand why the pilot did not look at his display for 4 minutes. This slide shows a recreation of the picture on the Otter pilot's Chelton display around the time the Otter pilot recalled last looking at it. Targets to the west, including the Beaver, which is shown as a filled cyan target located 4 miles away, were generally aligned with the typical route used for returning to Ketchikan, shown here as a dashed green line. The Otter pilot's intended course, shown by the dashed red line, was east of that route. As evidenced by his post-accident statements, the Otter pilot did not expect the other airplanes to cross his path. Experience with typical patterns in the environment commonly drives these sorts of routine intuitive judgments that influence monitoring. Oral alerts draw pilot attention to conflicting traffic they might otherwise miss. Visual alerts on a traffic display can help them locate it. Beaver's for-flight application could provide oral and visual alerts, but these features were disabled by the Otter's incomplete broadcast of ADSB data. The Otter's Chelton unit could also provide oral and visual alerts, but this feature was disabled by a 2015 equipment change. Therefore, both pilots lacked alerting that could have drawn their attention to the impending collision. Mid-air collisions account for 2% of all fatal aircraft accidents, but 7% of fatal Part 135 sightseeing accidents. Therefore, mid-air collisions are overrepresented among air tour accidents. A unique risk factor for some Part 91 and Part 135 air tour operators is the concentration of aircraft in some scenic areas. Use of cockpit traffic displays with oral and visual alerting would reduce the risk of mid-air collisions in areas with frequent tours. The FAA has the authority to establish temporary special federal aviation regulations, or SFARs. The FAA has previously used this authority to improve air tour safety in the state of Hawaii. Requiring air tour aircraft to be equipped with ADSB-supported airborne traffic advisory systems with oral and visual alerting in high-traffic tour areas through an SFAR or by other means would reduce mid-air collisions. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. Thank you. Mr. McGladrey will now continue.
Good morning. I will now provide some history of the Alaska Capstone program and describe how an equipment change in the Otter affected operation of the ADSB system and its effect on the Beaver's traffic alerting features. In response to a 1995 NTSB recommendation to improve aviation infrastructure in Alaska, the FAA created the Alaska Capstone program, a forerunner of the national ADSB program. Among the goals of Capstone were to decrease controlled flight into terrain accidents, mid-air collisions, and weather-related accidents. Between 1999 and 2006, as part of the Capstone program, the FAA and industry developed and installed ADSB equipment in hundreds of Alaska aircraft at no cost to operators. The Otter in this accident was equipped with the Capstone ADSB equipment in 2005. The Capstone equipment in the Otter consisted of a Garmin GDL-90 ADSB transceiver, a Chelton display unit, and a Garmin GSL-71 control panel. The GSL-71 supplied pressure altitude data to the GDL-90 from an altitude encoder. The GDL-90 transceiver broadcasted the Otter's position and altitude to other aircraft and ground stations, or ADSB out, and also received position and altitude information from other airplanes and ground stations, or ADSB in. The GDL-90 sent the position and altitude data from other airplanes to the Chelton display. The GDL-90 also had algorithms for traffic alerting and would send oral alerts and changes to the visual presentation of aircraft targets to the Chelton display to highlight threats. In December 2006, the FAA announced integration of Capstone into the FAA's Surveillance and Broadcast Services, or SBS, program office, tasked with implementing ADSB across the national airspace system. The ADSB out standard was updated in December 2009, and the ADSB equipment installed in the Alaska Capstone aircraft had not been qualified to the standard. In December 2012, the FAA initiated an upgrade to the existing Capstone ADSB transceivers to comply with the new ADSB out standard. The proposal's stated intent was to maintain the ADSB in functionality of the current Capstone avionics. However, in 2012, the RTCA had not settled on an acceptable traffic alerting definition in the ADSB in DO 317A standard. The FAA decided to proceed with the upgrade to the ADSBs, even though there were no requirement for oral or visual traffic alerting. The ADSB upgrade was awarded to Free Flight Systems, and eventually all Capstone airplanes were retrofitted with Free Flight Ranger 978 transceivers. The upgrade to the Otter's ADS-B occurred in 2015. The GDL-90 was replaced with the Free Flight Ranger 978, and the other components remained the same. The Ranger 978 still sent traffic information to the Chelton display. However, it did not have the capability to generate oral or visual traffic alerting. Another significant aspect of this configuration is that the Ranger 978 was powered independent of the GSL-71. So the GSL-71 was not required to be on for the ADS-B to operate. However, since the pressure altitude was provided to the ADS-B through the GSL-71, if it was not on, the ADS-B would not receive pressure altitude for broadcast. A review of the ADS-B data recorded by the FAA revealed that the Otter was broadcasting its position, but not pressure altitude at the time of accident. Wreckage documentation showed that the GSL-71 was in the off position. The airplane flight manual supplement for the ADS-B stated that the GSL-71 control panel must be in the alt mode during all phases of flight. To enter alt mode, the power knob is positioned to on and the alt button is selected. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. The Beaver was not part of the Capstone program, but it had a Ranger 978 installed. However, it did not have displays capable of showing traffic, so the pilot used an Apple iPad with a ForeFlight application to display traffic. As described by Mr. Sauer, the iPad ForeFlight application had its own traffic alerting features, which could have provided visual and oral traffic alerts. However, because the Otter was not transmitting pressure altitude, the ForeFlight traffic alerts were inhibited. There was an additional impact of the missing pressure altitude with the current ForeFlight application. Since the application could not determine the target's relative altitude from the own ship, it treated the target as distant. With the high distant traffic settings on, targets without altitude information do not appear on the ForeFlight application at all. Even if the target is close, it will not be displayed because the altitude is missing. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 required the FAA to initiate rulemaking to require aircraft operating in capacity-constrained airspace be equipped with ADS-B in technology by 2020. The RTCA continued on the ADS-B in standard, and in June 2014 released DO 317B, which had an optional application for traffic alerting. The FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 repealed the requirement that the FAA initiate rulemaking to require ADS-B in technology, and instead directed the FAA to ensure that any regulations resulting from that rulemaking had no force or effect. Thank you. Mr. Bryce Banning will now continue.
Good morning. I will discuss operational factors and the potential benefits of a safety management system. Mountain Air Service began operations in 2012 and employed one pilot and operated one airplane, a de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver. The pilot and owner had about 11,000 total flight hours. Taquan Air employed about 25 pilots, with the majority of them being seasonal, and operated about 10 de Havilland DHC-2 Beavers and 3 de Havilland DHC-3 Otters. The pilot of the Otter was a former airline pilot in his second season with Taquan Air, and he had accumulated about 25,000 flight hours. As previously discussed, the Otter was equipped with a GSL-71 control head that supplied pressure altitude to the free flight UAT. An exemplar GSL-71 powered on is pictured here. Staff's investigation determined that the GSL-71 was off during the accident flight. The unit was likely turned off during maintenance activity 2 weeks earlier and was never subsequently turned back on. The Otter pilot indicated that he was unaware that the unit was off during the accident flight. However, he believed that the ADSB system was functioning because there was no indication from other pilots or the Chelton display that the pressure altitude was missing. Staff explored the Otter pilot's training on the system and how the GSL-71 was incorporated into TAC-1's standard operating procedures. The pilot of the Otter was trained and qualified in the accident airplane. His most recent recurrent training included 8 hours of Capstone electronic flight instrument system training. However, during a post-accident interview, he could not recall receiving an explanation of the purpose of the GSL-71, nor did he have a clear understanding of the function of the GSL-71 and its role in supplying pressure altitude information to the airplane's ADSB system. The airplane's checklist did not contain a line item for the GSL-71 power switch or settings, and the pilot said that checking the GSL-71 control head knob was not part of his standard pre-takeoff flow of checks. Staff believes a procedural safeguard such as a checklist item could help mitigate the hazard of the GSL-71 being inadvertently left in the off position. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. The FAA has published guidance in the Aeronautical Information Manual and in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge addressing the pilot's role in collision avoidance. However, neither publication specifically addresses the limitations of human visual monitoring, the benefits of incorporating cockpit displays of traffic information in a pilot's traffic scan, or the importance of alerting for avoiding collisions. Due to the previously discussed limitations of the see and avoid concept, staff believes it is important for the FAA to update existing literature to include the limitations inherent in visual scans for traffic and the benefits and best practices of using cockpit displays of traffic information to supplement visual scans. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. In addition, aviation industry groups could elevate awareness of mid-air collision risks and countermeasures by briefing their members on the details of this accident and encouraging their members to become thoroughly familiar with the traffic awareness and equipment and alerting equipment in their aircraft. And if they do not have such equipment, the importance of installing and effectively utilizing it. Staff has proposed recommendations in these areas. TAC-1 Air implemented an SMS after the accident. However, they did not have one at the time. FAA SMS guidance indicates that operators should perform a risk assessment when undergoing an equipment change. In this instance, an SMS could have identified the loss of traffic alerting that resulted from the Capstone UAT upgrades and highlighted the need for a risk mitigation strategy. SMS could also have enabled TAC-1 to identify the risk posed by operation of its Capstone-equipped airplanes with the GSL-71 in the off position and highlighted the need for a procedural safeguard in this area. The NTSB has long advocated for the implementation of SMS in Part 135 operations. Staff has proposed a reiteration of a recommendation in this area. Mr. Chairman, this concludes the presentations. Staff is prepared to answer any questions.
Mr. Banning, thank you and the rest of the investigative staff for a very comprehensive investigation and capping it off with those presentations. We'll now turn to questions from the board members, and we'll begin with Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, staff. As the chairman has noted, mid-air collisions have always been with us, and some people said when they added the second aircraft after Wilbur and Orville first flew, the potential went up. The very formation of our air traffic control system was based on a mid-air collision between two airliners, and ever since we've identified a need to improve and evolve our collision detection system. We got transponders in the 1970s, traffic collision avoidance systems known as TCAS in the 80s. Mode C was mandated in certain high density airspace, that's altitude reporting, after the Cerritos collision in 1986. So how good was TCAS? Well, very good, actually. There has not been, up to this point, one collision between two airliners or an airliner and a general aviation aircraft in midair since it was implemented. So that's a pretty impressive record. Last year, FAA required all aircraft to be equipped with ADS-B out in certain airspace through the use of satellite and towers, as previously described. I think we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the limitations of see and avoid, because it depends as much on luck as it does on diligence of the pilot. And I've flown both barefoot without any CDTI and with, and I can tell you it's much better to have with. So for see and avoid, and I guess this is for Dr. Bramble, in order for that to work, pilots have to first see in order to be able to avoid, and there have been quite a number of studies on the topic and some of the limitations going back some decades. Could you briefly describe some of them?
Certainly, Mr. Vice Chairman. Interest in this topic really took off in the 1970s with multiple studies of pilot detection of airborne traffic. One such study examined unalerted visual acquisition of intruder aircraft by general aviation pilots and found that the probability of detecting aircraft on a near collision course with a closing speed of 120 knots doesn't reach 85% until about 12 seconds before a collision. By contrast, pilots using oral and visual traffic alerting can be expected to acquire that traffic about 8 seconds earlier, according to mathematical modeling. And other studies have found that visual alerts and display of traffic reduce the time after that, or after an alert, to locate, or a pilot to locate a target.
So how long has NTSB been discussing this and thinking about it, and the weaknesses of see and avoid in high density airspace?
Well, as you mentioned, our interest goes back at least as far as the Grand Canyon accident in 1956. In 1969, there was a collision between a DC-9 and a PA-28 in Indiana that killed 84 people, and we cited the inadequacy of the see and be seen concept, as it was called at the time. And in 1969, we did a study on mid-air collisions at the NTSB and found that the see and avoid was a concept that, well, may be, at least in high-density terminal areas, on its way to becoming outmoded, unsafe, and incompatible with saturated operating environments. We subsequently recommended the requirement for TCAS, as you mentioned. And then in the 1980s, we recommended the development of low-cost traffic alerting systems for general aviation.
Now, as I mentioned, having flown both ways, in my earlier career, I was lucky, and now I would feel absolutely naked without flying for this. And here it seems like in this particular accident that an unfortunate sequence of events led to this particular problem. Thank you very much for the background, and I'll have some other questions in the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Landsberg, thank you very much, and Member Hamady.
Thank you, and hopefully I don't have any audio problems. Please let me know if I do. So I deployed to this Midair to Ketchikan with the investigative team when this Midair collision occurred, and I do want to start by saying, because we have 6 lives that were lost, at least 9 serious injuries and 1 other minor injury, but numerous lives impacted. And I know that there are a number of family members and friends of loved ones who died or were injured in this tragedy that are watching. And I just want you to know that we have thought about you a great deal over the last 23 months, and going forward, you will be part of our work to make sure that our safety recommendations issued today are implemented. So our hearts do go out to you as in the coming months and years. But I do want to thank some of our partners as well, because I think it is critical to do that, because we do get a lot of assistance from our partners on scene, and we really appreciate their efforts. And I just want to thank the Ketchikan Volunteer Rescue Squad, Temsco Helicopters, NOAA Fisheries Office of Law Enforcement, the U.S. Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, South Tongass Fire Department, North Tongass Fire Department, and Ketchikan Fire Department, and a Good Samaritan, Mr. Chuck Hannes, who used his personal boat to assist in rescuing passengers after the collision. I do think the draft report was very well written, so there are lots of staff that put in tremendous efforts in putting this together, but I do want to thank Ms. Jill Demko for her efforts, because I really feel like this was a very well-written draft report, and thank you for that. I do have a couple of questions, Mr. Bannon, if you could yeah, I probably don't need slide 43, but I just wanted to ask a couple of questions on that. You said that the Garmin GSL 71 was off during the flight, and you mentioned, was it 9 to 10 days it was off, or 2 weeks? How long?
It was about 2 weeks.
About 2 weeks. And how did we determine it was 2 weeks? What did we track that back to?
The aircraft was broadcasting pressure altitude prior to going into maintenance about 2 weeks before the accident flight. After it came out of maintenance, it no longer was broadcasting pressure altitude. So we believe that it was turned off during the maintenance activity.
Is that a normal, is something normal that would occur in maintenance, or we just don't know why it would have been turned off?
We don't know why it was turned off. Mr. Crookshanks may be able to shed a little light on the maintenance activity that took place, but we don't know why it was turned off.
Okay, well, so we had 2 weeks where pressure altitude wasn't showing at that time. This GSL 70 was off. In those 2 weeks, how many flights occurred during the 2 weeks on that aircraft, and then how many pilots had flown during that time?
There were about 38 flights that occurred in that 2 week period. The airplane was operated by the accident pilot and another pilot. And in addition, Within those 38 flights were 5 flights that were IOE, where the accident pilot had initial operating experience, where he was supervised by a check pilot during those flights. One of those IOE flights was conducted by the chief pilot of TAC 1 Air.
Okay, thank you.
At the time.
Thank you very much. I have follow-up to questions to that, but I'm out of time, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. And Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got some questions about the airspace. Was there any air traffic control of the airspace where the Beaver and the Otter were operating?
Thank you, Member Graham. At the location in Ketchikan, there was no air traffic services provided.
Okay, so there was no radar coverage or any kind of communications with the FAA with air traffic control then in that airspace?
There was no communications and very limited radar.
Okay, so how did the operators there deconflict with each other in this airspace, since it was there were a lot of operators and it was the beginning of the tourist season? How did they deconflict?
So back in roughly, there's a letter of agreement that exists between the operators, and the original letter of agreement was issued back in 2009. That letter of agreement provides airspace users, such as the operators that are in the Ketchikan area, different frequencies, different altitudes to fly at. They identify some what they refer to as choke points, areas that can get a little bit more confined with a little bit more traffic. They also identify some standard routes of the tours, given weather conditions and environmental aspects that allow those flights to occur in certain areas at certain times. And they also have some best practices identified on what pilots should be doing during those particular operations.
Yeah, I'm looking at that letter of agreement, and I see that there's looks like 14 operators that signed that agreement initially at this revision back in 2017. One of them being Mountain Air, who was the owner operator, and then the chief pilot of TAC 1 Air. And out of that agreement, it states that this was established for safe operating practices in the Ketchikan and Misty Fjords National Monument Wilderness Area. The intent is to ensure horizontal and vertical separation of aircraft and to ensure aircraft in the same area are on the same frequency. Was this LOA required by the FAA?
No, sir. It's strictly a voluntary agreement amongst the operators.
Correct. Voluntary compliance. So when they sign this, it says here in the top of it, all operators signing this document are indicating voluntary compliance with the routes and procedures. So do we know if the Otter pilot was aware of this LOA?
I believe that that question was asked during our course of follow-up interviews with the pilot, and I would have to defer to either Mr. Banning or Mr. Bramble on whether that question was specifically addressed to the pilot and what his response may be.
Okay.
Bryce,
I can tell you, Mr. Bramble, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, he was aware.
He was aware? Was he aware of the whole LOA? Because in the interview that I read, it didn't seem like he was aware of the LOA itself. He was aware of some of the reporting points, but I don't think he was aware of the whole document.
We don't have confirmation that he read the entire document, but he was aware of the standard routes and call out points. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I know since then they have come out with addendum that actually they're having all the pilots basically read, fully understand it, and sign it. So I credit them that it's unfortunate that wasn't happening beforehand, especially with a Part 135 operation, which requires a lot of training and the documentation to go along with it, that you were trained or you were aware of that. Did either of these aircraft fly over any required reporting points for that LOA during the accident flight?
We did take a look at that, Member Graham, and at that point in time, as they diverted over towards that Mahoney Lake area and that scenic waterfall, there was no reporting points over in that area.
Yeah, so there were no reporting points required that I could tell. There may have been one early on when they took off, but it's my understanding we don't have any transmissions of that either.
Yeah, unfortunately, the common traffic advisory frequency is not recorded or captured out there.
Okay. I did see in the interview that the Otter pilot did say that this was his third flight of the day on the pretty much the same route, it appeared, and that he normally would call Lower Mahoney for Upper Mahoney at his altitude, but he couldn't remember on that flight if he had made that call or not. Of course, they were just approaching the Mahoney Lake area, so again, that's not a required call in the LOA, and I see my time's up. Thank you.
Member Graham, you're quite welcome, and thank you for your questions. And Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join my colleagues in expressing the most profound condolences to those who lost loved ones or who suffered harm because of this tragic event. Our investigation shines a sorrowful light on the flaws inherent in the see and avoid principle on which aviation has historically relied. Today, unlike an earlier time in aviation, we have the means to supplement see and avoid through technology in the cockpit. That is not to say that see and avoid should be abandoned, and pilots obviously remain responsible for vigilance, but the risk of collision can be significantly reduced through technology, and modern tools should be used appropriately to help ensure that tragedies such as this one are avoided. With respect to questions, the draft report we're considering today focuses on areas referred to as high traffic air tour areas. What are some representative examples of the sort of high traffic air tour areas referenced in the report?
Thank you, Member Chapman, and good morning to you, sir. Some of the examples that we use in the report would be the Ketchikan area. There's high traffic tours areas in Hawaii that have special regulations. They operate under the Grand Canyon. Some other examples would be the New York City area, Las Vegas. And so just a few of the examples that are cited in the report.
I presume some national park areas, certainly in addition to Grand Canyon, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Are the air tours flying in such areas, are they typically operating under Part 135 of the Federal Aviation Regulations?
Typically, yes. Most air tour operators are Part 135.
And to what extent are Part 91 operators providing commercial air tours in these high traffic tour areas, to the extent we know?
Unfortunately, I don't have the key statistics on those numbers, but I do know that there are a number of areas that Part 91 revenue passenger air tour operations do take place.
I assume that's a minority of the operations because of the fact that, at least to do so lawfully under Part 91, there are some pretty significant limitations on the sort of operation that can be conducted. Is that correct?
I would agree with that, yes.
And of course, we just did some work on the report that you all put together recently with respect to Part 91 revenue passenger carrying operations. And that's very good work. And I think there's clearly some overlap here with regard to the issues that we dealt with in that report. Now, a wrinkle which is somewhat unique to air tours is that Part 136 of the FAA regulations also applies to those that are operating commercial air tours. So a Part 135 air tour operator or a Part 91 air tour operator, it's my understanding that they are also subject to whatever requirements are imposed upon them under Part 136. First of all, am I correct about that? And if so, in terms of individual operators conducting tours under those regulations? How do these various parts of the FAA regulations interact?
So from my understanding, on the Part 136 rule, which is related to mainly Hawaii and in the Grand Canyon, there's certain equipment requirements as it relates to survival gear and so forth that are installed and those aircraft are equipped with. As it relates to the Ketchikan area specifically, that's a Part 135, but mainly the operators are in the Part 135 operating rules in Ketchikan.
Okay, we might need some clarification on that. My reading of Part 136 is that it applies to all air tour operators. While there are some specific requirements regarding Hawaii and also national parks, that the application of Part 136 generally applies to all air tour operators. I have some more questions about this. If you all have an opportunity in the interim, you might just take a quick look at that so that we can discuss this in a little more detail. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. I want to start by saying that 1 year ago, this agency had never conducted a virtual board meeting. We weren't sure if we could do it, how we would do it, and would we do it. But on April the 28th of last year, we held our very first virtual board meeting. And since then, including today's virtual board meeting, this will be the 12th virtual board meeting that this agency has conducted in 51 weeks. And I think that ability is a tribute to many individuals and many departments within the NTSB. Our IT staff provided us not just with the software teams that we use, but with the platform, with the bandwidth, the connectivity ability. Our modal offices have figured out how to make it work. Our board members, a tribute to my colleagues to be able to figure out how to do it, and to other offices such as our managing director's office, safety recommendations and communications, our administrative services. All of these entities come together to support the ability to do these virtual board meetings. And I do know that there's other federal agencies that have not reached this level. So yes, we might have some technical glitches every now and then, but I congratulate the NTSB staff and board members for what we've done over the last 12 months. You know, as far as the timeliness of reports, we say that we typically, and Ms. Schultz, I think this will be a question ultimately for you. We talk about the timeliness of our reports, and it's generally, we're trying to get a report out within about 12 to 18 months, and we can do that on occasions. But this one, there were so many nuances that we had to, your investigative staff really had to understand and figure out. This was not just, oh, this is a known problem. Your investigators had to really figure this out. Can you talk about, not to mention the challenges of having a worldwide pandemic for the last 13 months, but what technical challenges might your staff have encountered along the way?
Apologies, sir. Yes, good morning, Chairman, and thank you very much for the question. Indeed, that this particular investigation had a number of facets to it that were very technically complex. The equipment of the aircraft themselves, which were not, were very customized, if you will, or somewhat unique to those particular aircraft. And in every accident, but particularly one like this, where wreckage recovery and evidence recovery takes sometimes a considerable amount of time to exercise that due diligence to get recordings, video recordings, if you will, if we can get access to those, to be able to document the wreckage, to even be able to find all the wreckage when we're dealing with a midair collision that happens in the air. So there were a lot of complexities, and perhaps the most arduous part of it was the technology, the ADSB technology, understanding how all the components in these aircraft systems communicate with each other, within that system, as well as with each other and the ground stations.
Thank you very much. I've got a number of questions, and I think I will start on that. I've got about a minute. The limitations on the see and avoid and on conspicuity. I'm not sure exactly who to direct this question to. It might be Dr. Bramble, might be Mr. Sauer, but I noticed that the switches for the Beaver strobe lights were found in the on position, but the switches for the aircraft position lights and the anti-collision beacon were found in the off position. Would these lights being off have any appreciable reduction in the conspicuity of the Beaver, given that it was a clear day?
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your questions here. As it relates to the switch positions that the investigative staff identified following the accident, we have to remember that both airplanes were subjected to some pretty traumatic impact, as well as descent and collision with terrain. So staff at that point is really all we do is identify the switches, what position they're in, but whether they were in those positions prior to the collision is unknown. I'll let Dr. Bramble speak on behalf of your question as it relates to identifying the lighting while operating the aircraft.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so the anti-collision lighting would be much less conspicuous in the daytime and bright daytime conditions, particularly the rotating beacon and other types of lights. The strobes would probably be the most likely to attract attention because of the flickering would sort of trigger the motion scent detectors in the periphery. But because the Beaver was largely obscured by the window post, we didn't think it was a huge factor in this case regardless. So.
Perfect. I just wanted to check that block and make sure that we had addressed that, and I believe you have. Okay, we'll go to the next round, and Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We spent a lot of time talking about safety management systems, and in the case of the Beaver operator, that's a single pilot, single airplane operator. Perhaps Mr. Banning or somebody could give me a little bit of background. We talk a lot about, or the FAA talks a lot about, the scalability aspect. Could somebody tell me, how does an SMS work if it's just you and as a single pilot, single aircraft operator?
Yeah, an SMS is, as you said, scalable. And Dr. Bill Bramble is our safety management systems expert. So I will turn this over to Dr. Bramble.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bryce. Yeah, so the FAA has put out some good guidance on how SMS can be scaled for smaller operators, and it can be as simple as a notebook where you keep track of your proactively identified hazards and the mitigation strategies that you have in place to address them. The key is to be thinking proactively about hazards before mishaps occur, and that requires some imagination and some commitment and some follow through.
Are there any examples of how this would work? A lot of people sometimes don't have all that much imagination, and they like to have a little guidance on how to do it. Are you familiar with anything in that area?
Yes, the FAA has an advisory circular on safety management systems that discusses this in some detail. And the International Civil Aviation Organization also has a safety management manual.
Okay, thank you. We're talking a lot about high density airspace and some of the problems engendered with it. Have there been any studies done to look at the collision potential within high density airspace to see, what might work? When ADSB was mandated, it was pretty much done within existing controlled airspace, such as Class B and Class C, and obviously in positive control and above 10,000. But do we have any data in that regard? Because clearly these tour areas are, I think by most definition, probably more than the typical density. And the more marbles you put in the box, the greater opportunity they are for a couple of them to come together.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Chairman. So the ADSB requirement from the FAA, it largely, as you kind of indicate, parallels where transponders were typically required. Busy airspace around airports, which is under the rule for ADSB out requirements, it's Class A, Class B, Class C, certain components of Class E. Up in the Ketchikan area, well, the accident did occur before the 2020 out mandate occurred or was required, but also that area wouldn't have had the ADSB out requirement as well. And we know both airplanes were out and in equipped. But as it relates to the collision rates and accident rates, at this point with ADSB being as new as it is, other than this accident, I believe there was one in Soldotna, Alaska, a few months after this accident, one in Idaho as well. So we are starting to come across some additional data points regarding aircraft that are equipped with ADSB. So we're definitely keeping an eye on it. And we have had accidents with some legacy type systems that provided traffic advisories. So we know accidents with this equipment can still happen. However, ADSB, I think, is heading towards that goal of significant reduction. So
does it make sense to start to identify what high density airspace is outside of the, I'll use the term, traditional areas? I feel a little bit like Justice Potter Stewart in his famous quote that says, you know, I can't always identify it, but I know it when I see it. And in terms of airspace, I think most of us could probably start to point to some areas where it might make sense that there be some serious review of that. Your thoughts?
So as far as this accident, the scope of this accident, we were mainly focused up in that Ketchikan area with air tour operations. Are there other areas, confined areas in the United States? Absolutely. But for the scope of this investigation, we were mainly focused up in that area and the air tour operations at this point.
Okay, thank you. My time is up. We'll go to the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, Vice Chairman, you're quite welcome. Member Hamady.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bannig, I just want to follow up with a couple of questions, just following on my last round of questioning. On the, was there any indication in the manual or anything on the GSL-70 which stated some of its limitations if it was in the off position or?
Yes, the aircraft flight manual supplement for the GSL-71 said that it needed to be on and in the alt mode.
And did TAC 1 know that?
TAC 1 was not aware that the loss of alerting took place with the UAT upgrades. And I think interviews would suggest they had a general lack of understanding of the significance of this system, of what the GSL-71 did.
Okay, that leads me into my next question. Oh, I forgot to turn on my timing. So hopefully, Carl, when you remind me, I'll take that as a cue. So, you have on one of the slides in 2012, the FAA initiated an upgrade to Capstone ADSB equipment to comply with new ADSB out requirement in 2012. The ADSB in DO317A standard had no requirement for oral or visual traffic alerting. Did we find in the investigation that anyone knew there was a change in no traffic alerting whether it was FAA PIOs or any operators?
The FAA indicated when asked if Southeast operators were informed of the loss of alerting with the UAT upgrade, they said yes, a local surveillance and broadcast service representative informed operators verbally, and the free flight AFMS, Aircraft Flight Manual Supplement, was provided. However, there was conflicting information. The operator, TAC-1, indicated that they were not aware that the loss of alerting occurred with the UAT upgrade, and 3 Alaska principal operations inspectors with the FAA, 2 of them indicated they were not aware of a loss of alerting, and the 3rd could not recall.
Okay. So did FAA headquarters know?
Yes, the response that we received that a local surveillance and broadcast representative notified the Southeast operators, that came from AVP 100.
Thank you very much. So I want to, the 4 minutes, you or it may have been Dr. Bramble mentioned 4 minutes that one of the pilots did not scan because he was headed towards a waterfall. Do we know what occurred during those 4 minutes? And I apologize if this was asked before. I had to leave the meeting a couple of times just to technical difficulties. So.
Yeah, no problem. It wasn't asked. What happened during that period of time was the Otter pilot was basically just maneuvering across a peninsula towards George Inlet, and just prior to crossing that peninsula, he recalled glancing at his display and seeing a line of traffic to his left that was headed sort of generally aligned with the more common route back to Ketchikan, and thinking that they were on that common route and that they would not be pose a conflict for him.
And during that 4 minutes, did we find, because I'm sure some people will want to know, was there any sort of, tour operations going on, any sort of discussion? Was there any distraction with conversation with passengers, or what was occurring in that four minutes?
I reviewed the interviews we conducted with some of the passengers on the Otter, and they all stated that they did not recall any statements from the pilot or any narration from the pilot around the time of the collision. He wasn't speaking that often to the passengers. He was playing music to them over their headsets. And then as he was approaching the collision area, he was engaged in studying the wind direction on the surface of the water in case he lost an engine over the mountains when he proceeded over the Mahoney Lakes area. He was looking for emergency landing areas and maneuvering the airplane to place the waterfall on a 90 degrees to the airplane so the passengers would see it. And he was slowing down in case he encountered turbulence and descending. His goal was 105 knots, so he would have been monitoring the airspeed indicator. Prior to the collision, he had listened to the ATIS for Ketchikan, the weather information, and lined up the broadcast frequency for the Ketchikan harbor so he could swap that in. So he had things that he was engaged in doing, but they all appeared to be operational in nature.
Okay, thank you very much. I see my time's up, so I'll have a few more questions for you in the next round.
Sure.
Thank you, Member Hamady and Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad the chairman that brought up some questions about lighting and everything earlier, and I agree with the comments on the lighting that it would have been very difficult in the day to see just about any kind of light unless it was directly pointing at you like a landing light or something, and the strobes would probably be the best bet, but it might be difficult on a bright day. But I do have a question about the lighting on the Otter. We talked about it in the draft report about how the lights that were equipped on the Otter are having position lights, landing lights, and anti-collision beacon. But later on, we talk about the cockpit examination on page 21 of our draft report, and it states that lighting indicated switches for the position lights and the left and right landing lights were intact and in the on position, but we don't say where the position lights for the strobe or anti-collision lights are. Can you answer that?
Yeah, thank you, Member Graham. Yeah, as you noted in page 21 of the draft report, we will be making an editorial change to that to include it. We reviewed photographs taken after the accident of the switches in the cockpit, and the anti-collision beacon light that's references the aircraft is equipped on page 12 of the report is identified as a strobe light placard in the cockpit on the instrument panel. So we'll be making a editorial change to the report in that regard.
Excellent, thank you. And I don't think it would have made a whole lot of difference with the angles of this collision, but thanks for that. Also, I know we don't know whether the iPad on the Beaver was on and had all the correct selections to receive the ADSB in data, and we know the issues without the pressure altitude from the Otter going on, but how would the Beaver pilot how would he have heard any kind of audio warnings in his system? Would he have been able to hear the audio alerts?
So the way his system was configured is the iPad is a Wi-Fi connection to a controller within the Beaver that's a free flight control head as part of the ADSB transceiver system. That also has the ability to Bluetooth to his headset, and his headset was Bluetooth capable for audio purposes. Nice. That's a pretty nice setup for an aircraft like that. And for those who have that out there, you need to be able to hear the audio too, especially in a loud cockpit like that. That'd be pretty noisy. I also like to address the GSL 71 that Member Hominy had brought up, and looking at the pictures of the instrument panel in there and the location of the GSL 71 control head, I'm not surprised that the Otter pilot, one, I know he didn't quite understand the whole operation, nor did TAC-1 Air, but not surprised that he didn't see that it was not in the on position, because was that control head in his normal field of view? So, Member Graham, yeah, you're referencing a photograph from one of the presentations. I believe it was Dr. Bramble's presentation that showed the configuration of the Otter's cockpit, and that photograph was taken on a flight just prior to the accident. You do note that the PFD and the MFD, the Chelton Flight Logic display units, are directly in front of the pilot seat, the left seat position, where the GSL 71 is over on the right-hand side, all the way up against the right side of the fuselage of the cockpit. And it's also mixed amongst some other radio and some audio functions with the tour operations. It's kind of buried in that stack on the right-hand side. Certainly not consistent with a location where it would be in his normal field of scan to identify. Correct. Thank you for that. And I will tell you, as my previous career before coming to the board, I did one of my jobs was doing a lot of post-maintenance check flights, and it is not uncommon to get into an aircraft after maintenance to have all, if not all, the avionics turned off, because those are turned off so the mechanics can work on the systems without them being energized, so they don't get shocked or anything. The other thing too is when they're jacked up, weight off wheels or whatever, they don't want them to be transmitting also and giving nuisance alerts to other aircraft in the area outside the hangar. So it is not uncommon to have all the equipment off when a pilot receives an aircraft coming out of maintenance. That makes it imperative that a pilot follows the flight manual and checklist, and your checklist should be
just like the flight manual, and making sure you get everything turned on before you taxi or take off. So a good operation with a good SMS would have caught that. And I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Member Graham, thank you for your good comments. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A recommendation we'll consider today calls on FAA to identify high traffic air tour areas and require Part 91 and Part 135 air tour operators within those areas to equip with ADS-B out and in, supported by traffic advisory systems. The draft specifies that one way this ADS-B equipment requirement could be imposed is through what's called a Special Federal Aviation Regulation, or SFAR. I agree with the general thrust of this proposed recommendation, and of course, an SFAR is one way an SFAR is one way that an ADS-B requirement could be imposed. But is it the only way, and are there any particular advantages to relying on an SFAR?
Thank you, Member Chapman. I will turn this over to Dr. Bramble, who's done some research on the SFAR as well as other means.
Yes, Member Chapman. So staff would like to see all aircraft equipped with this technology eventually. We have observed that the rulemaking process for national ADS-B standards has been time-consuming and complex, and so our hope was that by targeting limited subsections of the aviation operations areas, that it might be possible for the FAA to achieve speedier action and more quickly protect a larger share of the traveling public. As you mentioned, an SFAR coupled with an SFRA defining specific areas that could be considered high traffic air tour areas is one way to accomplish this. It was done in Hawaii in the 1990s in response to a rash of air tour accidents with some success, and then those rules were rolled up into the Part 136 regulations eventually, as you mentioned. So, you know, it's possible that they could target this requirement differently, either potentially through Part 136 or through national requirements. But this was just one idea that we came up with.
And that's fair enough. And I want to express my own view, which is that an SFAR in the context of air tour operators, and I say this because I have some experience at a previous point in my career with regulating air tour operators. In the context of air tour operators, an SFAR, I don't believe, is the best means of imposing an ADS-B requirement. Deploying the rather unusual SFAR mechanism risks triggering other potentially difficult and unrelated issues, including operational restrictions and environmental considerations. Those are valid considerations, but they are generally site-specific, and they often entail a certain degree of controversy, and I think that slows down the process. Perhaps those issues need to be looked at for other reasons, but with regard to an equipment requirement, an ADS-B equipment requirement, I think they become an obstacle. So to illustrate that there are some other possibilities, I want to explore a couple of ideas. Excuse me. Our draft today also recommends that FAA require all Part 135 operators to be equipped with ADS-B out and in, supported by traffic advisory systems. So a broad requirement applicable to all Part 135 operators would apparently apply to all those conducting commercial air tours under Part 135. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as for those, and I believe, Mr. Sauer, I think you said earlier, and I believe this to be correct, that most air tours are conducted under Part 135. So a broad application would capture the majority of commercial air tour operators. As for those that are lawfully conducting commercial air tours under Part 91, and again, lawfully doing so, is it possible that ADSB equipment could be required by including a regulatory mandate in Part 136 of the FAA regulations, which again, I interpret as applying to all air tour operators?
Thank you, Member Chapman. We did do a little bit of research in between your line of questioning here on the 136. You're absolutely correct that all air tour commercial operations are conducted under 136 to include also 121, 135, 91 LOA tours, etc. It does not apply, however, to balloons and gliders. There are some exceptions to the rule. But I would have to say, as far as your question in regards to applying the recommendation to the 136 versus potentially 135, is, in my understanding, your comment there, correct?
Well, I think you can get at this two ways. You could capture Part 135 with a broad requirement for all Part 135 operators. You could conceivably capture the Part 91 tour operators by imposing a requirement in Part 136. And that, of course, would also apply to Part 135 operators.
Absolutely. We'll have to defer and talk to staff and get their opinions on those thoughts.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll close, and I appreciate your indulgence here. My view on this is, rather than requiring ADSB in certain specified airspace areas, I suggest a better approach is to require ADSB for all of those conducting certain specified types of operations, in this case, air tours. That captures the folks that we're trying to address here that are operating in these high tour, commercial air tour airspace areas. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I have a feeling we'll be discussing that later in the meeting. Let me start my clock, which just went away. Dr. Bramble, you brought up, in response to a question that the Vice Chairman raised, you brought up a mathematical modeling study and something about 85% probability in 12 seconds. Can you just rephrase that for just a moment, please?
You want me to re-summarize that?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you've got it right in front of you, I've got it in front of me. But
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So it was an MIT study involving. They told the participants that they were looking at VFR workload, and then they flew intruder aircraft at them from 3 different angles, and then they measured the time it took for them to detect unalerted the target. And then they used the results of those observations to create mathematical models of probability of detection depending on closing speed, and then they generated some tables using that.
So the bottom line, I think there's a very high probability, in fact, about an 85% probability, that an intruder aircraft would not be detected until what point? How many seconds?
There's an 85% probability that it would be detected by 12 seconds to collision. However, at 24 seconds, there's only about a 50% probability.
Yeah. 85% that it would be detected by 12 seconds. Now, what does the FAA advisory circular on mid-air collision avoidance say the amount of time that it takes to recognize, to identify a threat, recognize it as a threat, determine a course of action, and then apply that course of action?
It states 12 and a half seconds.
12 and a half seconds. So see and avoid is, as we continue to find out, is not, it does have inherent limitations. And we've been pointing that out for a long, long time, as you pointed out, going back a long way. And is there a paradox here? It seems like there's a paradox, is that we're as pilots, we're taught that if the relative motion does not change, if it does not change and you don't do anything differently, that aircraft is going to eventually hit you. Is that what we're taught?
That's correct.
And that's the fact. It's not just what we're taught. But the paradox is that the peripheral vision does better with detecting motion.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So we do know that sea and avoid has limitations, and we've seen that time and time again. Thank you for your comments, Dr. Bramble. Mr. Sauer, a week or 10 days ago, I sent you an article that you said you had also seen. It talks about technology that's being developed for artificial intelligence that can have cameras to actually aid pilots in this see and avoid concept. Do you have any additional information on that?
No, I recall, Chairman. Yeah, obviously, the short article that we both observed on one of the aviation websites or publications there, and for example, is in the automobile industry, the technology on collision avoidance and camera sensors and things of that nature is developing at a rapid pace, installed on almost every new vehicle you can purchase today, and the same is being examined and explored and researched and even tested in the aviation community. I don't think with the way technology advances today that we're too far away from some equipment out there that's available.
Right. And since we do have these limitations on see and avoid, since we've repeatedly over years found that it doesn't work as well as we would like for it to, it looks like technology is a lot of the answer. And as the Vice Chairman pointed out, once we implemented TCAS, that had significant efficacy in reducing mid-air collisions. I want to go back to something. I'm going to read a probable cause statement. The board determines that the probable cause of this mid-air collision was that the pilots did not see each other in time to avoid a collision. It's not possible to say why they did not see each other, but the evidence suggests that it was the result from any one or a combination of the following factors. And I'll read some of these factors. Visual limitations due to cockpit visibility, preoccupation with matters unrelated to cockpit duty, such as attempting to provide the passengers with more scenic view, and physiological limits on the human vision, reducing the time opportunity to see and avoid the other aircraft. This issue of mid-air collisions and failures of the see and avoid have been here for literally my entire life. There have been two references this morning to the Grand Canyon crash, June 30th, 1956. That was the then world's largest aviation disaster with 128 fatalities. It was a mid-air collision. That was the day I was born. 65 years we've been talking about this, and probably even before. So I am hopeful that the recommendations that we come out with today will help to further drive this continuing problem down and get rid of it once and for all. So I'm going to call for a break. I would invite all participants to turn off your cameras and mute your mics. We will go into a break now. We will reconvene at 11:25, which is about 12 minutes from now. We are in recess. We are back in session, and we'll begin with the next round of questions with Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sauer, I'm going to ask you a number of rhetorical questions, and it'll be obvious where I'm headed, I think, in a little bit. Do Part 91 aircraft operate in high traffic tour areas? Just pure Part 91?
I would say more than likely, yes.
I think that's a good answer. Are they required to have ADSB out when operating in those areas?
Depends on if that area is defined in the airspace requirements for ADSB out.
Right, which we've already defined as pretty much below Class Charlie or Class Bravo and so forth. So certainly highly possible that they could collide with a Part 135 or Part 91 passenger carrying for hire operator. Is that correct?
There is a possibility, yes.
Right. And so I think, our objective here is to make sure that regardless of which phase of flight they're operating under, the key point is when you've got a lot of marbles in the box, which we've talked about, the potential for collision goes up significantly. And as we've talked about, see and avoid just doesn't seem to work very well in these high density areas. So I'm laying the groundwork here that I may introduce an amendment as we go downstream and get to that point. Ms. Schultz, outside of the high traffic tour areas, are there any other areas where we might have some high density traffic?
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I would say that as part of this investigation, we looked, as Mr. Sauer mentioned earlier, very closely at the air tour geographic locations, but and specifically in Ketchikan area and Alaska. But there quite possibly could be.
Right. I think FAA actually has a charting methodology that they use, and they refer to them as alert areas, places that, well, South Florida, where there's a lot of high density student training, around Fort Rucker in Alabama, where the Army has a little helicopter training school, and other high density areas. And our challenges go forth from this. And it seems like this would benefit from some additional study on our part, or possibly working with the industry to figure out if there's a better way to manage some of this. I know as when I was an active flight instructor, our practice area was a high potential collision area, and we actually did have an airplane from our flight school collide with another aircraft. Fortunately, they both landed safely, but with damage to both of them. So just any particular thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, for this particular investigation, that was a bit outside the scope of it, but the agency we have investigated other midair collisions, and I think for the industry to look at the general technology, the ADS-B technology that the maturation that we're at today in this year and going forward, it would be something that would produce some good safety improvement potentially.
Very good. Well, thank you. I hope that we're able to continue that dialogue. Mr. Chairman, I don't think I have any more questions at this point. If something occurs to me, I'll ask, but thank you very much.
Certainly, you're entitled to ask more questions if questions come up. Member Hamady.
Thank you very much. If somebody could put up slide 39 for a second. And I'm going to read something real quick, and probably Dr. Bramble will answer this. So the accident that the chairman mentioned on June 30th, 1956, the report states collision studies, including controlled flight tests, have pointed out that seeing other aircraft in flight is difficult. The degree of such difficulty is variable, with numerous tangible and intangible factors affecting it, including cockpit vision or the vision afforded by cockpit structure and design only, and it goes on. So I just want to echo what the chairman said. For 64 years, we've noted this, at least. This has been a serious issue with see and avoid concept or method of collision avoidance. And on page 56 of our report, or the draft report, it states that, and then also states ADS-B supported airborne traffic advisory systems can mitigate the risk of mid-air collision accidents. However, ADS-B out is only required in certain airspace, and there is currently no requirement for ADS-B in. We have previously advocated for ADS-B in. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 required the FAA to identify the type of avionics required for all classes of airspace. In fact, Section 211 includes discussion of identifying the ADS-B in technology that will be required under next gen. Unfortunately, we also state that the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 repealed the requirement that the FAA initiate rulemaking to require ADS-B in technology, and instead directed the FAA to ensure that any regulations resulting from that rulemaking had no effect. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because Section 522 of the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act actually stated the 2011 Section 211 of the 2012 Act, subsection B, is repealed, and the administrator shall ensure that any regulation issued pursuant to subsection has no force and effect, which of course at that time they didn't have a regulation implemented. But if you could talk a little bit about that, and I have another question regarding that. Do we know why?
We were puzzled by that that repeal that occurred in 2018. As you noted, ADS-B was mandated to be required by 2020 in the 2012 authorization. And the FAA began developing performance standards for ADS-B applications and began briefing OMB in 2014 on their rulemaking plans. And then the effort stalled and Congress repealed the ADS-B mandate in 2018. And therefore, only ADS-B out went into effect as a rule. So it seems to have stalled that effort.
And I think there seems to be some discussion, at least among current Hill staff, that may or may not have been the intent. But as we all know, if an agency takes that as the intent, that could be exactly how they believed it to be the case, or they just didn't want to move forward on it. That's another possibility. Was there any discussion with FAA on what they believed the intent was?
We did speak with staff who worked at the staff level at FAA on the rulemaking effort that was in its early stages, and they also did not know the reason for the repeal. But they interpreted that change, that repeal, as basically instructing them to stop work on ADS-B.
Yeah, I've seen that in other agencies where that has occurred. Is that maybe one reason why? So, and I'm reading from page 57. Despite the repeal of the rulemaking requirement related to ADS-B, the FAA has the authority to establish special federal aviation regulations for a finite period. You also mention special flight rules area. Is that one reason you're mentioning that? Because FAA does believe that was repealed as potential options?
Yes, and that was our staff's impression initially as well, was that the FAA had been directed not to make nationwide rulemaking on ADS-B.
Okay. All right, great. My time is up. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Member Hamady, and Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some questions about the Capstone project and the equipment required for that. So I don't know who that'll be, but I'm going to start asking a couple questions about it. As part of the Capstone project, the Otter was equipped with a Garmin GDL-90 transceiver capable of conflict situational awareness. In December 2012, the FAA solicited proposals to upgrade those existing avionics in the Capstone program. At this time, which standards did the FAA require the new avionics to comply with?
Thank you, Member Graham. This is Steve Mouhadri. They required that the new upgraded equipment comply with DO 317A.
Exactly. So, and specifically, it stated the DO 317A that the conflict detection application, which is considered immature, has been deleted. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So when the FAA put out the RFP, did it require a conflict detection application at that time?
No, it only pointed to 317A. FAA did note in discussions with them that it was that the and OEM could include alerting, but it was not required.
Not required. Okay. So in May 2013, the FAA selected free flight systems to replace the existing Garmin transceiver. Did the transceiver did the free flight transceiver provide a collision detection application?
No, it did not.
No. And when we asked, the NTSB asked free flight why they didn't include a conflict detection application, what was their response?
Because it was not part of the requirements.
Correct. So it wasn't part of the TSO, so it wasn't required. So the FAA solicited proposals to upgrade a system with conflict situational awareness, a vital important safety protection, but did not ask those submitting proposals to include this technology. However, when asked why the upgraded transceivers did not include a conflict detection application, what was the FAA's response?
Well, they pointed to that they hadn't yet developed the algorithms that eventually came out in 317B in 2014. They weren't specific about why they made that decision at that time to go forward with a standard that didn't require it.
Okay, I think that they talked about the algorithms and the detection application was immature. Is that correct? They made a statement like that, I believe.
Yes, the detection immaturity was actually something in 317, the original version, that was more of a hockey puck and not a complicated algorithm for traffic detection.
And I think they also stated too that there was no legal pathway to force Garmin to provide their proprietary software to another manufacturer. Is that correct?
That's true.
That's true. Okay, so I want to focus on the no legal pathway reason. Is it standard business practice to share proprietary information with a competitor?
No.
No, it's not. Had the FAA asked for a conflict detection application in the RFP, could it have been provided?
Yes.
Yeah. So they didn't ask for it. So.
Right. Or they could have specified that they use different MOPs, such as the TCAS MOPs for alerting.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So that would have been spelled out in the RFP then, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So the bottom line, the real reason that the conflict situation application was not installed in the DHC-3 is simply because the FAA did not ask for it when they solicited proposals to upgrade the avionics.
Correct.
Is that a correct statement? Okay,
yeah.
So that's real. All right, thank you. I see my time is about up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Member Graham, I think you're really getting to the crux of some very important issues there. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up quickly on Member Hamidi's line of questioning. I know my colleagues are aware I was one of the folks that were involved in the staff negotiations on the Federal Aviation Reauthorization Act of 2018, and I did some checking with respect to the provision that she referenced, which is Section 522 of that bill. An earlier draft of our report described Section 522 as repealing a requirement that was imposed in a 2012 FAA bill, which required FAA to do a rulemaking to require ADSB in. The 2018 repeal was described in our earlier draft as a ban on a congressional ban on regulations. I don't see it that way. I couldn't recall that there had been any discussion among staff with respect to imposing a ban. I'm not aware of any members of Congress that sought to impose a ban. In fact, Congress understands and is enthusiastic about ADSB as one of the foundational technologies in the FAA's next gen program. So I did some checking with some of my former colleagues, and while this is not definitive, none could recall that there had been any controversy about that provision. None saw it as imposing a congressional ban on regulations. We saw it, I think, across the board, or at least most of us did, as simply clarifying, removing a requirement that had been put in place in 2012 that obviously wasn't going to happen by 2020, which is what the 2012 provision called for. And there had been some logistical and practical challenges along the way in implementing FAA's ADSB out mandate, which also was supposed to and did in fact become effective in 2020. So FAA may, or some at FAA may interpret that repeal as having more significance than I believe it has. And certainly it's possible it could be read as being some sort of an obstacle to FAA rulemaking. If that's the case, I would encourage Congress, some of my former colleagues on the staff, to take a look at this and consider clarifying that point, because I don't believe that that's what was intended. I do just want to point out, though, that to the extent there was a ban on regulations, I know our staff had considered an SFAR, a special federal aviation regulation, as a possible way around that ban. But an SFAR is a regulation. So if there was a ban on regulations, I don't think that an SFAR would have been the escape hatch to get around that. Again, just clarifying, and that I think it's an important point. I hope that is not interpreted as being any sort of obstacle to FAA regulating here, because I do think FAA should regulate. And as we're going forward on this is something we should continue to monitor. On another subject, I want to commend our team for the really outstanding work done to complete the cockpit visibility study and the associated animation. It's difficult to watch, obviously, but I found it exceptionally helpful in understanding the circumstances leading up to the tragic collision. At a high level, I wonder if I could ask our team to describe for us how that study was prepared and what data or other sources were relied on.
Good morning, Member Chapman. Thank you for the question. Don O'Callaghan here. I'm the aircraft performance specialist for this case, and I can hopefully answer your question about how the cockpit visibility study went together. The purpose of a cockpit visibility study is to determine how each airplane would have appeared in the field of view of the pilot of the other airplane, and specifically to determine whether the airplanes would have been visible through the airplane's windows or hidden behind blind spots, such as the window post, the instrument panel, a wing, or any other structure. And so to do this, we draw the line of sight from the pilot's eyes to the other airplane, and then determine if any airplane structure, besides the windows, of course, intersects that line of sight. And if structure does intersect the line of sight, then the other airplane will be obscured from the pilot. Now, to draw that line of sight, we need each airplane's position, which we have from the ADSB data, and we also need each airplane's attitude, that is, its heading and pitch and roll angles. And for the Otter, that attitude data was recorded by the Tilton Avionics. And for the Beaver, it was not recorded, but we computed its attitude from the trajectory defined by the ADSB data. And then to determine if any of the aircraft structure intersects the pilot's line of sight, we also need to define the geometry of the airplane that the pilot's sitting in. So for this accident, we used 3D laser scanners to measure the geometry of exemplar Beaver and Otter airplanes that were provided by TAC-1 Air. They let us scan a couple of their airplanes, exemplar airplanes. So we measured the interior and exterior of the entire airplane with laser scanners. And then finally, we have to present the results of the visibility study. And as you pointed out, we've found it's most intuitive to recreate the pilot's view on a computer screen, just as you saw in the animation earlier. And in that animation, I'd point out that those semi-transparent gray areas representing the cockpit structure are exactly the geometry that we measured with the laser scanner. So that's kind of how it goes together.
Well, thank you for that. Again, difficult to watch, but a very valuable investigative tool, and we thank you for your good work. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome, Member Chapman, and I want to tag on to that, Mr. O'Callaghan, I think it was about 110-page, 111-page report that is in the docket was incredible in the sense that it was an amazing piece of work. And just to make me feel even really stupid, you added a lot of math at the end of it, sine and cosine and tangent and square root and things like that. So, but an investigation is not just one piece. It takes the entire team to pull it together. But I think the aircraft performance and visibility study, cockpit visibility study, was key to understanding a lot. Let's slow down
Thank
just
you.
for, yes, sir. You're quite welcome, and thank you. I want to just slow down just for a second. There's a lot of terms flowing around. Some of you, most of you know that I flew for a few years, and even having the benefit of having been a pilot, my head was spinning the first time I read this report. And I know that those in the audience are a lot smarter than I am, but let's just slow down and kind of unwind this thing. So is it true that before 2015, the system that the Otter had in it was called a Garmin GDL 90, which did have the capability to generate visual and oral alerts and display that on the Chelton EFIS? Is that correct?
Yes, Chairman.
And is it also true that in a 2015 upgrade, supposedly upgrade, when the GDL 90 was taken out, the new system, the Ranger 978, did not have algorithms to generate alert messages and send to the Chelton display? Is that correct?
Yes, sir. It would show traffic, so the cyan symbols, both filled and unfilled. But if it had no algorithms to determine if it was so close, so that it would change them to yellow flashing symbols as it did before, and it had no capability to send an oral alert.
In the older system, prior to 2015, what would that oral alert have said to the pilot?
It would have just said traffic, with no information about like on the Beavers about bearing range.
Yeah. But that's what we would get in the airline environment using TCAS. We would get a TA, traffic alert, and then we would look down at the screen, see what the relative position was, and then look out and try to visually acquire it. And then if it elevated to an RA, resolution advisory, it would give us escape maneuver information. So how does a system that's supposedly an upgrade end up degrading a very important capability of taking out the ability to generate oral and visual alerts?
Well, we agree. We agree that those very important capabilities. Of course, we tried to highlight all the capabilities that the new ADSB systems brought to the table in terms of weather, new navigation routes, and indeed, it still provides traffic awareness in the display. But we think that is an important feature to be lost.
I just don't understand it, though. I mean, it's a critical function because we don't expect pilots. We don't want pilots glued to looking at the display. We want pilots monitoring the flight instruments, monitoring the flight path, looking out the window, looking for traffic. So by taking out that oral alert capability, that was a huge, I don't even know how to describe it. It really degraded the system, and I'm not sure I understand why that happened, how that happened.
We do have Mr. Bill Bramble can maybe fill in some details about the questions we asked of the FAA and their responses.
Please do, and then I'll be out of time after Bill's answers. Go ahead, Dr. Bramble.
Yeah, I think the 30,000-foot view is that the Capstone program was sort of the beta test of what ADSB could do. And part of the reason that they wanted to implement it was to provide a number of things, including this traffic detection, alerting, and display. It worked very well. But when that beta test was over, it got rolled into the broader national program efforts, and those efforts were behind where the beta test, the initial innovative program, was. And so that capability seems to have sort of fallen by the wayside as a result of the bureaucratic inertia of the broader national efforts and the time it took to develop those performance standards.
So I'm out of time. Maybe there's a yes or no answer to this. Did the FAA perform a risk assessment? We asked people to do a risk assessment before changes are made. How did this get missed?
We specifically asked whether or not this was an oversight or whether it was a conscious decision, and did they risk assess the impact of that decision? And they never directly answered the question whether they risk assessed the loss or the decrease in mitigation of this risk. They just described to us the status of the various performance standards and how they were not prepared to, they did not have adequate standards available to roll it into the national requirements.
Thank you. I think we ended up with very much of an unintended consequence of a supposed upgrade to a system. As I understand it, Vice Chairman, you do not have any questions at this point. If you do, you're welcome to go.
Well, thank you, sir. I do have perhaps a comment and maybe a question. But having lived through this era of the transition and being on the industry side at that point, there was a concern, and this started with weather in the cockpit, that the FAA was going to over-engineer the system, and it was also going to drive up the price to the majority of users. And when the electronic flight bags really started to mature, which was before this time, they had figured out how to do traffic alerting and with oral alerting as well. And I flew with those systems for years, totally separate from the Capstone environment. And I think, sometimes the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. And as we have seen, the four-flight system in the Beaver had all of the capabilities with one thing missing. And so we get into a situation where FAA actually, rather than encouraging improvement, maybe blocked it a little bit. As you said, it was an unintended consequence. So I guess I would ask staff, do you share that view, or do you have something different?
Yeah, so, they were trying to do the right thing by replacing this equipment that they had to encourage people to install that then no longer complied with their new requirements for ADS-B out. But by giving everyone a new box that had lesser capability, they disincentivized the maintenance of that alerting capability.
But the industry itself took it on to do this because the electronic flight bags stepped into the breach, if you will, both Garmin and ForeFlight. And while they used the so-called hockey puck design, it worked very, very well. So I think, I can't say I'm pleased with how the FAA managed it, but I also know that as far as weather in the cockpit and quite possibly in this area, the industry was quite concerned about the fact that they were going to overthink this, and the cost of the equipment was going to go asymptotic. And we have seen multiple occasions of where that has happened, where only the top end could afford it and the bottom end, which is what you really needed, we're not going to be able to. That's the only question or observation I have, Mr. Chairman.
Great observation from somebody who was in the industry at the time. Member Hamady.
Yeah, I just want to get back to what I raised in the last round of questioning, which is the congressional repeal in 2018. If a rulemaking is required on ADS-B in, regardless if it's 2020 or some other time, and then Congress later repeals it and says any requirements or regulations that have been issued have no force and effect, that is a pretty strong statement by Congress to an agency, whether it was intended or not to be seen as a ban. So I do agree with Member Chapman that I think Congress does need to clarify what was intended to the FAA. I mean, I was on the Hill for over 14 years, and I've seen many times where agencies interpreted something that may or may not have been the intent of Congress. So I do hope that there is a clarification by Congress on this issue. With that, I do want to ask a question of Director Hatchett, who's the director of our Safety Recommendations and Communications Division. I started the discussions or my questioning during this meeting talking about how this meeting is really the first of many actions that the NTSB will take to improve aviation safety and to prevent a similar tragedy from occurring again. And so I was hoping you could feel free to take the rest of my time to talk about what your division does to ensure that happens.
Thank you for that, Member Hominy, and the opportunity. NTSB recommendations can prevent future accidents and save lives only if acted upon. Otherwise, they're just words on a piece of paper. So after the board meeting, our work continues. In my office, the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications, we track and evaluate responses to NTSB recommendations, and we work with all of you and staff to advocate for the adoption of those recommendations. We record responses to all of our recommendations we issue. The organization that receives the recommendations, such as the FAA, writes to the NTSB periodically describing what they plan to do, what they have done to satisfy the recommendations. We will then evaluate each of these responses and determine whether the action taken has satisfied the recommendation or is likely to once the action is completed. A letter is prepared and approved by the board describing the response and classifying the status of the recommendation. In addition, we inform Congress, governors, state legislatures about our investigations and recommendations, and we monitor federal and state legislative efforts to improve safety. We provide requested information to congressional staff about our open recommendations. For example, our recommendation that the FAA will require all Part 135 operations to establish a safety management system. Likewise, we will provide information as requested for any new recommendations that come out of today's meeting. We regularly update Congress regarding the status of recommendations as they conduct oversight and consider legislation. We facilitate board member meetings and we work with staff, and we have appearances for all of you to keep open safety recommendations in the forefront using various communications platforms. We also participate in media engagements, arrange roundtable discussions, and forge collaborations with external stakeholders to keep the pressure on. And we manage the most wanted list, which identifies the top safety improvements that can be made to prevent accidents, minimize injuries, and save lives. Just a few weeks ago, we held the most wanted list meeting where the 2021-2022 most wanted list of transportation safety improvements were voted on by the board. Require all Part 135 operators to establish safety management system programs was on that list. And it was on the 2019-2020 most wanted list. So thank you, Member Hominy, for giving me the opportunity to explain what happens at the NTSB after the gavel comes down. It is truly the beginning, not the end, of a critical aspect of our work.
Well, thank you for describing all your efforts, and you and your staff do great work. So thank you so much. No further questions right now.
Thank you very much. Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the staff's presentation on ADSB out and its requirements in certain airspace. And I think we also have a much better understanding of if both aircraft were properly configured to have ADSB in, that each cockpit of these aircraft would have had traffic position information that would have been relevant and helpful to avoid this. But what if these aircraft had ADSB in, what other benefits are there to have an ADSB in?
Thank you, Member Graham. They're advisory in nature, but they also provide what's called FISB, or Flight Information Service Broadcast. Flight Information Service Broadcast is a number of different products, mainly related to weather. They can receive airmets, SIGMETs, PIREPs, different information regarding weather can be transmitted and broadcast to those ADSB and equipped aircraft. But then also the traffic advisory information that can be received, or TSB. And that's, again, an advisory service only.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, that's important, not just the traffic, but weather, especially up in Alaska, in that area. It could be very significant for aircraft with this performance level and flying in that very challenging environment up there. So this may be a question for our recommendations group, but how long ago did the NTSB begin advocating for ADSB in technology?
Since 1969, we've supported the use of technologies that provide certain identification and location information for aircraft. Very
good. Yeah, it's been a long time, like we've already talked about, and I believe in 2008, in response to an FAA's notice of proposed rulemaking for requiring ADSB out, the NTSB responded in a letter and expressed concern that the FAA did not plan to require ADSB in capability because, according to the notice of proposed rulemaking, it has not been defined or identified as a requirement for maintaining the safety and efficiency of NAS operations. But our letter also continued that the board believed that this assessment was incorrect and that the equipage of aircraft with ADSB in capability would provide an immediate and substantial contribution to safety, especially during operations in and around airports, which are high traffic, high density airspace. And I would say probably in some of these tour locations also, we would probably add on to that at this point. So been over 13 years we've been asking for ADSB in, and we're not quite there yet. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have and questions. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you very much. Member Chapman.
Mr. Chairman, just a couple of quick follow-up questions, and this will conclude my questioning. I don't know, I really don't know anything about air tour activity in the Misty Fjord area. Is this a year-round activity? And I'm going to guess that this accident occurred during what amounts to the peak season in that area. Is that correct?
So generally, obviously weather dependent, but most of the industry starts the latter part of April, if not the first weeks in May. That's when the traditionally the cruise ship operations begin and travel up the Alaska beautiful scenery that's up there, and then goes all the way till September, October, and then begins to slow down, obviously due to weather considerations.
Okay. And regarding air tours generally, I'm curious, to what extent do other tasks, such as providing tour narrations, for example, contribute to distraction and perhaps further compromise the effectiveness of see and avoid in the context, again, of commercial air tours?
Thank you, Member Chapman. I think I will go ahead and let Dr. Bramble, who did explore those issues specifically with this accident and the surviving pilot that we had on board. Dr. Bramble, do you want to address that?
Sure. As I stated before, in this particular case, we didn't see any direct evidence of that. I've worked quite a number of other air tour accidents, and we haven't had any direct evidence of, in other cases as well, that was occurring around the time of a pilot decision error or mistake of some kind. It's possible, and it's even possible it could have happened in some of these cases. We don't always have in-cockpit video or survivors, so but we don't. I haven't personally seen direct evidence of it as a contributing issue.
Yeah, thank you. I think some tour operators, not all, but some tour operators also tend to use pre-recorded narrations too, so that burden is taken off the pilot. But I do have a concern that this is an area where you're already in a high traffic environment, and if you have other responsibilities such as narrating a tour, that just increases the risk. Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions. I thank our team for really excellent work on this investigation.
Member Chapman, you've got a great point there. The regulation 135.100 is the sterile cockpit rule for Part 135 operators, and it says that things like sightseeing, pointing out sightseeing and things, are prohibited below 10,000 feet unless the cruising altitude is below 10,000 feet. So I would contend that once you're in your descent, you're no longer at cruise. So that's a really good point that you have brought up. And we did hear earlier today that I forget who it was, maybe Mr. Sauer said that we did not find, or maybe it was Dr. Bramble, that the Otter pilot was not doing a lot of announcing to the passengers, but still, it's a very important consideration. I want to turn to something that the pilot of the Otter told the NTSB, and I'd like to pull up, if you would pull up slide 41, please, because I want to talk about the functionality and the appearance of the GSL-71. So while we're waiting for that to be pulled up, in our interview with the pilot, we said that as long as everything worked on the Chelton screen, it didn't require any manipulation. And what he's referring to is the GSL-71. So let's see, there we go, slide 43. I guess the numbers changed. I'm sorry about that noise. I've had people working on my house this morning. They were quiet until 60 seconds ago, and then they decided to start drilling holes in my head. That's at least what it feels like. In any event, so if this system were powered off, would you see any display? I see right now 1200. I assume that's a squawk code. Would you see any LEDs illuminated at all on this GSL-71?
Chairman, this is Aaron Sauer. You would not see that those digits lit up like that, no.
Yeah, it would be completely dark. So again, the pilot of the Otter is saying that as long as everything worked on his looked okay on his Chelton, there was no need to manipulate this at all. And so he does go on to say, in the case of the ADSB, it was confirmed that by seeing other targets on the Chelton and other people seeing you, so as long as the Chelton showed targets, there wasn't any need to manipulate the avionics control head. Unfortunately, he was incorrect on that. And I think that slide 34, and the numbers are off just a little bit, but go to the one that shows that one right there. This one shows very well why you see the altitude goes through the GSL-71. So if that GSL-71 that we just looked at, if that's turned off, there's no altitude information that's going to go to the, well, let's see here. Let's go one more slide. Yeah, that one right there. Yeah, so if we turn off the GSL-71, no altitude information could get down to the Ranger system, but the Ranger system itself would still display traffic. Is that correct, Mr. Sauer?
Yes, and I may want to clarify something that you stated there, that the Ranger system will broadcast geometric altitude or satellite GPS altitude. The pressure altitude is the key data set that the GSL-71 provided to the Ranger system.
Yes, and unfortunately, the iPad, the Beaver pilot was using the ForeFlight app on his iPad, which only could see what type of altitude, geometric or pressure?
Due to the Wi-Fi connection, the pressure altitude was required to be transmitted in order for that Wi-Fi to go to ForeFlight. for the altitude readout.
Exactly right. So as I said earlier today, it's like they were speaking two different languages. The Beaver, I'm sorry, the Otter is transmitting geometric altitude, but the Beaver is only able to understand pressure altitude in terms of providing alerting capability. Did I say that correctly?
As far as the system was set up, correct.
Yeah, okay, we can pull that slide down. But it does show why, that slide does show why if the GSL 71 is off, the pressure altitude information will not reach and be transmitted. I think there's a real key point here, and that is, had the Otter, well, let me back up. I think the pilot's assumption, as a former pilot myself, I think the Otter pilot's assumption is reasonable. If you see the targets, and you see them on your EFIS display, and other airplanes are supposedly seeing it, you're not having anybody say, hey, I never saw your airplane on my display. I think his assumption was reasonable, but unfortunately it was wrong. And I think there needs to be greater awareness made so pilots understand this. The flight manual supplement, supposedly it was in the flight manual, but I've read that supplement several times and it's not real clear either. So okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think your thought process there is consistent with the Otter pilot's lack of training on the system, or incomplete training on the impact of the GSL 71, which was evident in the interviews that we were able to conduct with the pilot, that for the 2 years he was with the company, don't believe that component of the system was ever discussed, and that was also reflected into some of the interviews we conducted with the company management and their lack of understanding of the impact of that GSL 71 on the ADSB system. As the Otter pilot indicated to us, he saw targets, didn't have any other aircraft report that there was a problem, and things are good in his opinion.
Mr. Banning, I'm out of time, but Mr. Banning, you turned your camera on, so I'd love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to add that the pilot's mental model the GSL 71 flight manual supplement indicated that, and Steve McGladrey may be able to speak to this in more detail, but indicated that if the GSL 71 was off, the ADSB system would not work, which, as we know, is not entirely accurate. So I just wanted to add that his mental model of the system could have been influenced by the aircraft flight manual supplement.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so you're agreeing that the flight manual supplement may not have been abundantly clear. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think, like I said, Steve McGladrey may be able to speak to it, but I think also the flight manual supplement was not entirely accurate because it indicated, I believe, that the GSL 71 in the off position would turn off the ADSB system, which was not entirely accurate. You lost the pressure altitude, but the ADSB still broadcast.
Yeah, thank you. I want to take a pause for a second here because I've exceeded my time. Do any of my colleagues have any questions right now? Okay, I don't see any, but we'll certainly, I want to pause periodically to see if you do have questions. Yesterday, I was in a conversation with several of you, and I was saying, should we say that Talk-1 was, we don't like to use the word fault or blame. We don't use those. We don't use words like culpable because they have legal implications, but should they be cited in the probable cause because they did not properly perform a risk assessment to understand the nuances of this new upgrade. And likewise, the pilot in command has the responsibility to understand what his or her equipment is, and should he or she, in this case should he have been named in the probable cause. And Mr. Sauer, you had a very good point about what we could not say, and if you don't mind discussing that, please.
Thank you, Chairman Somewhat. So one of the critical pieces of information that we were missing during the course of this investigation was what was possibly or definitely being displayed to the Beaver on his iPad at the time that the collision happened. And unfortunately, due to the damage sustained to that iPad unit, we did recover the unit. It was sent to our laboratory for examination, and any data download or any information that device could tell us in relation to the ForeFlight application. And unfortunately, we were unable to recover any information. So the way the system communicates with each other, we couldn't definitively say whether the Beaver pilot even had the ForeFlight application turned on, whether he's utilizing it, and what the setup may have or may not have been, which does impact the rest of the alerting functionality and capability potentially that that application can provide.
So we can't say, what you're really saying is we can't say that even if yes, it's true, the Otter was not transmitting pressure altitude, but whether or not that information, if it had been transmitting pressure altitude, we don't even know if the Otter pilot would have, if he had high distance traffic on there. Well, let's see. If he had high distant traffic on there without pressure altitude, it would have the target would have completely disappeared from his visual display. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So we really can't say how his iPad was configured to have given him an alert. There was a really important point in the video, the animation that was displayed earlier. I think it's really key. Had the Otter been transmitting altitude information or pressure altitude information, the Beaver's equipment would have generated an oral and visual alert about 1 minute and 44 seconds before the collision, provided that the Beaver pilot was using his iPad to display traffic on his ForeFlight app. Did I hear that correctly?
You're correct, and that is based on the that hockey puck ring, if you will, around the own ship, around the Beaver aircraft. The minute that the Otter penetrated that hockey puck, the target would have changed to an alert.
And the Chelton system, if it was capable of generating alerts, it would have alerted the Otter pilot 37 seconds prior to the collision.
If the ADSB transceiver was designed to the 317B standards, again, the free flight ADSB transceiver was designed to the 317A standards. If it was designed to the B standards, what you saw in the animation is a simulation of the potential of when that alert would occur with that design system.
Now, if he would have had the old system installed, the GSL 90, the one prior to 2015 upgrade, if you will, what type of an alerting would the Otter pilot have gotten on his Chelton display?
I think Mr. McGladrey provided an explanation of that earlier, but I recall that it would alert traffic. But Mr. McGladrey, if you wanted to expand on that, go ahead.
Yeah, so the visual cues that it would change, it would have changed to a yellow filled in arrow and flashed, from what we understand. The only thing we don't understand is the algorithms of when that alert would have occurred.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to pause here. Any of my colleagues have any questions? I'd be glad to go to another round. I do have several more. I don't want to hog the time. All right, I'm going to move now to SMS. The Vice Chairman and I received a letter from the AOPA Air Safety Institute, signed by their AOPA Senior Vice President in the Air Safety Institute. And basically it said, this was a letter dated March 31st. It was in response to our 2 board meetings ago where we recommended SMS for all revenue passenger carrying operations. And we've long had a recommendation for Part 135 to have SMS. And in this letter, he states, this is the Air Safety Institute, we do not support any requirement that all revenue passenger carrying operations and even all Part 135 operations must meet and implement and sustain an SMS program. I have certainly respect for people's opinions, but I don't agree with that at all. And I think this tragic accident that we're dealing with right now is a good example of how SMS could have prevented this. And so I'd love for staff to just tell me, how could SMS have prevented this entire quagmire?
As we know, one component of the SMS of SMS is to perform a risk assessment on an equipment change, which we did have in this particular case. How in depth that risk assessment would be in reference to that equipment change, we hope would or could have identified that loss of alerting capability with the new transceiver.
Absolutely. The advice, as you said, Mr. Sauer, the advisory circular from the FAA that talks about safety management systems says that a company must apply safety risk management when implementing new systems, revision of existing systems, and development of operations and procedures. And that was not done in this case. And had they done so, had the FAA, had TACWIN done so, they may have identified that with the newer system, they were not going to get oral and visual alerts. And I think that is key to this investigation. It's key to this accident, this crash, this tragedy. And quite frankly, for a safety organization to come out and say they do not support SMS, it's shameful. Let the lobbyists make that call, but a safety organization should not be making that call. How many times have we, in the last 4 years, have we reiterated our recommendation for Part 135 operations to have SMS? How many times have we reiterated that rec?
We've reiterated safety recommendation A1636 5 times.
5 times. I'm sorry, Nathan, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's been reiterated every year since 2017.
I'd say the NTSB believes that's very important. In fact, as I said in my opening statement, that's now on our most wanted list. Do any of my colleagues have any questions? I have a few more that I want to go through.
I have a few questions there.
Yeah, please, absolutely. Go right ahead.
And it's really just to add on to what the chairman raised, the importance of SMS. Mr. Hoyt, can you talk about how long we've been recommending SMS? It's longer than just reiterating the last couple of years. We've been recommending it for quite a long time.
Sure. Our first recommendation on SMS was A0710, which was specific to Part 121 and resulted from our investigation of the Pinnacle flight that crashed into a residential area in Jefferson City, Missouri. But then with regard to Part 135, we've also made several recommendations, but A1636 is our most recent.
And we issued safety recommendation A0989 in 2009, which recommended SMS for helicopter air ambulance operations. But our recommendations have been broader on SMS really for the past 20 years or so, where we were surprised it wasn't broader than some of the areas that we see now where there's SMS. Have we seen any, how do we feel about the voluntary SMS program and whether that's been successful, and why would we need a requirement for SMS versus going through a voluntary program? Dr. Bramble, maybe, or Mr. Sauer.
Sure, Member Hamidi. Yeah, so I think this accident's actually a good example because this operator, TAC 1 Air, they had a safety program that was sort of modeled after the guidance from the Medallion Foundation, which promoted SMS conceptually, but it did lack that proactive aspect of risk assessing when you changed a policy, procedure, or equipment. And the FAA's guidance on SMS does promote those kinds of proactive risk assessments. In addition, I guess as far as coverage goes, we don't see a huge voluntary adoption of the FAA's approach to SMS compared to the number of operators out there.
Thank you. And in some recent communications with FAA, I think it was a letter from April. Well, we recommended SMS for Part 135 in 2016 and then didn't hear back from FAA for 3 years, I guess a little more than 3 years. And in that response, they stated that they were looking at determining the feasibility of expanding SMS to encompass Part 135, but that rulemakings were subject to revision and evaluation, including executive orders, which included the 2-for-1 rule, which was eliminate 2 regulations for every 1 you adopt under the previous administration. And I will note that those executive orders have since been revoked by the current administration, which we note on page 70 and 71. So as I've previously stated, that combined with recent statements by the FAA, I look forward to them now moving forward on SMS. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I agree. They need to move forward with it. Thank you very much. Member Graham, Member Chapman, Vice Chairman Landsberg, anything from you all before I get into one other topic? Okay. Mr. Sauer, yesterday I had a meeting with you and several others, and I wrote something down, and I want to see if you agree with this statement. Not that I plan to offer it as an amendment, but just to sort of put a cap on the idea of safety management systems, because as you said, one of the 4 components of safety management systems is safety risk management, to assess your risk anytime you're changing anything. So see if you agree with this statement. Because TAC 1 Air did not perform a safety risk assessment when adding the new avionics in 2015, the company did not understand the operations of the Garmin GSL 71, and as a result, did not develop adequate training, checklist, and procedures to ensure proper operation of the system. Does staff agree with that statement? Oops, sorry, my speaker. Aaron, you're muted.
I apologize, sir. I would say that safety risk management component of SMS, as it relates to the advisory circular guidance, does provide the opportunity, or would have provided the opportunity for a company like TAC 1 on an equipment change to identify the system limitations or changes to that system that had previously been operational, and then in turn provide adequate training to their staff and their pilots on the use of those systems.
So right there, that's really a justification for why we need safety management systems right there. Thank you very much. Mr. Fedock, I'd like to turn to you if I may, please, because in your survivability report, you pointed out that the passenger and the Otter pilot in the cockpit right seat perished, and she unfortunately suffered blunt force trauma of the head and neck and extremities, and contributing was drowning. I envisioned at the time that she may not have had a shoulder harness. I've since learned that she would have. I was 20 years old when I had the misfortune of meeting several trees while flying an airplane. I was not wearing a shoulder harness, and I banged my head forward on the glare shield. And had I been wearing, and I was the only one that was injured, but had I been wearing a shoulder harness or shoulder strap, I would not have banged my head on the glare shield. Wouldn't have been injured at all. I did notice that according to your report, the cockpit right seat remained attached to the section of the separated cockpit floor, and the seat belt was buckled. The lap belt was frayed and separated diagonally, and the single shoulder harness was frayed and separated horizontally across the webbing. Was the webbing cut by first responders, or did it likely fail due to overload during the crash sequence?
Both of those cuts were consistent with a separation by a first responder.
Okay, all right. So she was in that case, she was wearing her shoulder harness, is what you believe. Okay, all right. Some of the passengers said the seat belts were hard to release. Do we know if there was a safety briefing given to the passengers prior to flight?
Yes, sir. He did provide a safety briefing about the seat belts as well as the life vests.
Great, thank you very much. I was asked this morning by one of the surviving passengers if we've considered a requirement for life vest while operating air tours over water. Have we given any consideration for that?
That did not come up as part of this investigation, no, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask one last time before we go to the findings. Do any of my colleagues have any additional statements or questions before we move to the findings? Well, I'll sum up this situation. We've got a single pilot, and I do believe that single pilot operations can be conducted safely. It's the combination of all of this that I think led to the crash. We've got a single pilot conducting air tour operations, and again, air tour operations can be conducted safely. Single pilot air tour operations in areas where there's a high concentration of traffic, relying on the see and avoid concept, which has severe limitations, with a critical safety alerting system that is functionally disabled. And you know what that ends up with? It ends up with a formula for disaster. So with that, Mr. Curtis, I'd like for you to please read the proposed findings.
Thank you, Chairman. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 12 findings. Number 1, none of the following safety issues were identified for the accident flight. 1, pilot qualification deficiencies. 2, pilot impairment. Or 3, a malfunction or failure on either airplane. Number 2, The circumstances of this accident underscore the inherent limitations of the see and avoid collision avoidance concept, including how collision geometry, obscuration by aircraft structures, and limitations of human performance can make it difficult to see nearby aircraft. Number 3, oral and visual alerts that draw the pilot's attention to conflicting traffic presented on the cockpit display of traffic information can greatly increase the pilot's awareness of potentially conflicting traffic and avoid a collision. Number 4, because of the high concentration of traffic in popular air tour areas, the risk of collision is higher than in the general national airspace system, and technology that supplements pilots' traffic scans by providing oral and visual alerts can mitigate this risk. Number 5, although existing automatic dependent surveillance broadcast traffic alerting applications can help draw pilots' attention to conflicting traffic, these applications are currently not required. Number 6, the implementation of special federal aviation regulations requiring automatic dependent surveillance broadcast supported airborne traffic advisory systems with oral alerting and high traffic air tour areas would mitigate the risk of mid-air collisions. Number 7, the manner in which the ForeFlight application currently handles missing altitude data from traffic targets precludes the application from providing visual and oral alerts concerning these targets and, in certain configurations of the application, removes the targets from the moving map entirely, which degrades the ability of the application to call attention to potential collision threats. Number 8, because the Garmin GSL-71 can be manually turned off without any obvious indication on the Chelton display that pressure altitude is not being reported with the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast data, there is a potential for the GSL-71 to be inadvertently left in the off position, which can lead to other pilots not receiving appropriate visual and oral alerts of traffic. Number 9, the combination of automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, ADBS, components in the de Havilland DHC-3 did not have the same conflict detection capability that was present in systems installed as part of the Capstone program, which provided visual and oral alerting. This reduction in capability was the result of the Federal Aviation Administration's upgrade of ADSB equipment for aircraft participating in the Capstone program with components that did not maintain the existing alerting functions. Number 10, a procedural safeguard, such as a checklist item that addresses the position of the Garmin GSL-71 control head selector knob, can mitigate the hazard of the selector knob being inadvertently and indefinitely placed in the off position. Number 11, increasing pilots' awareness of the inherent limitations of the see and avoid collision avoidance concept and the benefits of cockpit displays of traffic information with traffic alerting can mitigate the risk of mid-air collisions. And number 12, if TAC 1 Air had been required to have a safety management system, SMS, at the time of the accident, the activities required by the safety risk management element would have provided better opportunities for TAC 1 Air to discover and mitigate the increased risk of airborne collision posed by changes to the Capstone affiliated avionics installed in its aircraft, which provides another example of the value of SMS for all Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators. Chairman?
Mr. Curtis, thank you very much. At this time, we'll do a roll call to make sure that my colleagues are present and prepared to deliberate. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I'm ready, sir.
Member Hamady.
Thank you very much. I'm ready to discuss the findings and other portions of the report.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Member Graham.
Member Graham's ready.
All right. Could you say that again? I don't see you and I want to pin you up on my screen so I can see you. So yep. I don't know.
Member Graham's up and ready to deliberate.
There you are. I'm going to pin you up. And Member Chapman.
Member Chapman is present and ready to deliberate.
Very good, sir. I see you all now. Are there any amendments to the proposed findings? I believe Member Chapman, you have one. Are there any others? Okay, Member Chapman, you are recognized. I believe you have an amendment to finding 6, perhaps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do want to offer an amendment to finding 6, and I'll read it. I circulated it in writing last night. I'll read my proposed amendment. As amended, I propose that finding 6 should read as follows. Requiring automatic dependent surveillance broadcast supported airborne traffic advisory systems with oral alerting in high traffic air tour areas through a special federal aviation regulation or other means would mitigate the risk of mid-air collisions.
Okay, thank you very much. There's Member Chapman's motion. Is there a second?
Second for discussion.
And Member Hamady seconds. So, Member Chapman, I turn it back to you for discussion.
Mr. Chairman, the purpose of this amendment is to clarify that an SFAR, a Special Federal Aviation Regulation, is one means, but not the only means, to impose an ADSB equipment requirement on air tour operators. The amendment harmonizes finding number 6 with the language of recommendation number 1 to the FAA. Finding 6 is the foundation for recommendation 1. I've coordinated this change with our staff team and I appreciate their assistance. I will also offer a related amendment to the text of the analysis section. That amendment will likewise tweak the analysis to clarify that an SFAR is one option, but not the only option.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Any discussion amongst my colleagues?
No, I just say I support the amendment.
Thank you. Seeing some head nods, I'd like to turn to staff, please.
Yes, sir, Chairman. Staff has no objection to this. We did review it, as Member Chapman mentioned, and we have no objection.
Okay, great, thanks. It's been moved and seconded to amend finding 6 as proposed by Member Chapman and seconded by Member Hamady. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we will now take a roll call vote. Those voting for the amendment will signal by saying aye. Those opposed will signal by saying nay. Member Vice Chairman Landsberg, your vote is?
Aye.
Member Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The amendment passes unanimously. Are there any further amendments to the proposed findings?
Mr. Chairman, not an amendment to the findings, but an associated amendment to the report. And I can offer that now or whenever you think it's appropriate.
Yeah, we'll catch that at the very end. So thank you for that. Anything related to the findings? Any further motions or amendments for the findings? Okay, we voted on the amendment. We've just approved that amendment to finding number 6. I'll now entertain a motion to adopt the findings as amended. Is there such a motion?
Second.
Okay. Vice Chairman Landsberg moves, and it's seconded by Member Hamady. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the findings as amended, as revised. Vice Chairman Landsberg, your vote?
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The findings have been adopted as revised unanimously. Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed probable cause.
Yes, sir. Staff proposes the following probable cause. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was the inherent limitations of the see and avoid concept, which prevented the two pilots from seeing the other airplane before the collision, and the absence of visual and oral alerts from both airplanes' traffic display systems while operating in a geographic area with a high concentration of air tour activity. Contributing to the accident were 1, the Federal Aviation Administration's provision of new transceivers that lacked alerting capability to Capstone program operators without adequately mitigating the risk associated with the consequent loss of the previously available alerting capability, and 2, the absence of a requirement for airborne traffic advisory systems with oral alerting among operators who carry passengers for hire. Chairman?
Thank you very much. Are there any amendments to the probable cause? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adopt the probable cause as presented?
So move.
Member Graham moves, and I believe Vice Chairman, that was you seconding. Is that correct? Been moved by Member Graham, seconded by Vice Chairman. Is there any discussion concerning the probable cause? We'll proceed to a vote. Vice Chairman, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the probable cause as presented. Vice Chairman, your vote is?
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The probable cause has been adopted unanimously. And Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed recommendations. And before we do, it's my understanding that you will first read the new recommendations. We will vote on those. And then you will, let's see, I thought we had a reiterated recommendation.
I will, yes, read the new recommendations, then one reiterated recommendation.
Yeah, okay, I see it now. It's 4.2 is the reiterated. Yes, so we will read and vote on the new recommendations, and then you will read, and we will not vote on, because the board's already voted on it, the reiterated rec. Is that correct?
It's amenable to me, unless Ms. Silba, General Counsel, has other thoughts.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure, because I knew we had discussion about that, but that was about 6 months ago. So, okay, very good. Then, Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the new recommendations.
Yes, sir. As a result of its investigation, staff proposes the following 9 new safety recommendations. 5 to the Federal Aviation Administration. Number 1, identify high traffic air tour areas and require, through a special federal aviation regulation or other means, that Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 91 and 135, air tour operators that operate within those areas to be equipped with an automatic dependent surveillance broadcast out and in supported traffic advisory system that 1, includes both visual and oral alerts, 2, is driven by an algorithm designed to minimize nuisance alerts, and 3, is operational during all flight operations. Number 2, require the installation of automatic dependent surveillance broadcast require the installation of automatic dependent surveillance broadcast out and in supported airborne traffic advisory systems that can include oral and visual alerting functions in all aircraft conducting operations under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 135. Number 3, review current and future supplemental type certificate installation instructions and flight manual supplements to ensure they provide provisions to prevent the inadvertent disabling of the broadcast of pressure altitude data by design where practical. Number 4, ensure that checklists for all Capstone program parents Phase 2 aircraft include verification that the Garmin GSL 71 control head selector knob is in the on position and that the unit is in the ALT mode before takeoff. Number 5, Update the Aeronautical Information Manual and the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge to include the limitations inherent in visual scans for traffic and the benefits and best practices of using cockpit displays of traffic information to supplement visual scans to help overcome these limitations. One recommendation to ForeFlight, number 6. Update your traffic alerting algorithms so that traffic targets for which there is no altitude information are assumed to be at the same altitude as the own ship, parents, that is, the aircraft receiving the target data. One recommendation to TAC 1 Air, number 7. Revise the checklist for your fleet of aircraft to ensure they include verification that the Garmin GSL 71 control head selector knob is in the on position and that the unit is in ALT mode before takeoff. One recommendation to aviation industry groups, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Experimental Aircraft Association, National Business Aviation Association, Tour Operators Program of Safety, Tongass Aircraft Pilots Association, and Helicopter Association International. Number 8, inform your members about the circumstances of this accident and encourage them to take the following actions. 1, become familiar with the traffic display equipment installed in their aircraft. 2, if their equipment does not provide an oral alert concerning proximate targets that might pose a collision threat, encourage pilots operators to supplement the equipment with devices that provide both an oral and visual alert. And 3, remind pilots to include the traffic display when scanning for traffic through the aircraft's windows. And one recommendation to the National Association of Flight Instructors and the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators. Number 9, inform your members of the circumstances of this accident and incorporate instruction on including the traffic display when scanning for traffic through the aircraft's windows in both initial and recurrent pilot training. Chairman?
Okay, thank you very much. Those are the recommendations. I understand we may have one amendment. I do have a question, however, if my colleagues would indulge. On recommendation number 1, so we're saying identify high traffic tour areas and require either an SFAR or other means to basically require Part 91 or 135 air tour operators that operate within these areas to be equipped with ADS-B out and in supported advisory systems. So let me ask you this. The assumption at TAC 1 was that their airplane was equipped with ADS-B out. In fact, I guess it was. If your system would have been if you on the receiving end would have been able to receive geometric altitude, technically that would have been a system that was broadcasting ADS-B out. Am I correct there? It's probably not a real clear question, but go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. Could you just maybe state that one more time?
Yeah, sorry about that. In the eyes of TAC 1, they were operating with an ADS-B out equipped aircraft and an ADS-B in equipped aircraft. It's just that it was the out function of it was disabled to those aircraft that could only process pressure altitude. Is that correct?
That's correct. The only data set that was not being transmitted to the from ADS-B out to the ground stations and so forth was the pressure altitude data set.
Yeah. So okay. So as I understand it, the FAA, depending on where we ask, the system that was used in Alaska, the new system, the one installed after 2015, some in the FAA thought it would have been compliant with this, and those in headquarters didn't think it was. What I'm really asking is, would the first part of this recommendation have prevented this operation, TAC 1, from operating in Alaska? Because they thought they had ADS-B in and out.
From what I read with the proposed recommendation number 1, but the first provision of that includes both visual and oral alerts.
Right. Okay.
That function is not consistent with the recommendation.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that this recommendation would actually prevent the situation that we had 2 years ago by Ketchikan. So thank you. I just wanted to make sure of that. And sorry for slowing things down, but I want to make sure that our recommendations are actually correcting the issue. Okay, any other questions or amendments? I think, Vice Chairman, you may have a proposed amendment. And are there any other proposed amendments, by the way?
Mr. Chairman, I want to point out what I think is a necessary grammatical correction. It's a minor one, but this is line 4 on page 77, line 4. I suggest that the word "to" should be struck to ensure that the recommendation is grammatically consistent.
So it would read Part 135, air tour operators that operate within those areas be equipped.
Correct.
Scratch the word "to." Be equipped with an ADSB. Okay.
And I can offer that as an amendment if it's helpful.
We can or we can't. And would anybody object to making that what I'll consider an editorial grammatical correction? I don't see anybody. Okay. And Ms. Silball, would you be comfortable, if the board is our general counsel, would you be comfortable with us just making that editorial correction right here?
Yes, sir. That's fine.
Thank you. Thank you for that verification. Member Chapman, thank you very much for that. And you're right. The word "to" in there implies that it could be something in the future, I think, to be equipped. We just want it to be equipped. Okay. Vice Chairman Landsberg, I recognize you for your amendment, your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move that we expand recommendation 1 to include all aircraft, not just Part 135 and Part 91 tour carrying aircraft that are operating in this whatever the FAA identifies as a high traffic air tour area, because collisions can occur between anybody regardless of the type of part rule that you're operating under.
Great. Would you be willing to put that in the form of a motion, and then we can discuss the rationale for it?
Yes, sir, I would. So I would move that we amend recommendation 1 to read as follows. Identify high traffic air tour areas and require, through a special federal aviation regulation or other means, that, and here's where the change comes, all aircraft operating in such airspace be equipped with ADSB out, and that Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, and it goes on from there as previously stated. So that is my motion.
You're muted, Mr. Chairman.
Is that what you sent out earlier today, maybe 9-ish or somewhere in there?
That is correct. That's the latest, and it is in all capital letters.
Yeah, I see it now. I was trying to find it. Okay.
This has been through several iterations.
Thank you. There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second for discussion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded for discussion. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you. So we have pointed out throughout this meeting that See and Avoid has severe limitations, and in findings 3 and 4, and also in the probable cause, we point out that See and Avoid is not as effective as we would like it to be. And as I asked in questions earlier, do other aircraft besides tour aircraft operate within this high density, potential high density traffic area? And the answer was, well, of course they do. There's no prohibition for people operating there. The possibility is that anybody operating within that airspace, if it's not within an area of radar coverage or some other way of identifying traffic, those aircraft can be absolutely invisible, period, to any ADSB in equipment. And the potential lists, again, I go back to the marbles in the box metaphor of you put a lot of airplanes in a single space and you don't have the ability to see it. I think we should be depending upon technology. We do not, I did not specifically indicate that the Part 91 aircraft need ADSB in, but they should certainly be broadcasting their position so that the commercial operators in there would have the ability to see them. And I think this is a significant oversight if we do not make this change.
Thank you. I'd love to hear comments from my colleagues, and then we'll turn to staff after that.
I have a couple of questions. The first question, so the addition of all aircraft operating in such airspace be equipped with ADSB out. Do you intend for the additional 1 includes both visual and oral alerts, 2 is driven by an algorithm designed to minimize nuisance alerts, and 3 is operational during all flight operations would apply to that?
No. And the reason is that they're not operating as a commercial entity.
Right.
All they are doing is letting the commercial entities know who are required to have it to say, hey, I'm here. If we don't have it, it's entirely possible that nobody would be able to see them other than to detect them by see and avoid.
Mm-hmm. And the other question I have is, by stating all aircraft operating in high traffic air tour areas, which is what it doesn't state it like that, but that's what you're saying. Do you include in that Part 91 and 135 aircraft?
I'm not sure. Yeah, it would say all aircraft have to have at least out. And we are in the subsequent part of the sentence saying if you're operating air tour, in other words, a commercial operation, passenger carrying, now you must also have the additional items specified that include visual and oral alerts and nuisance alerts and be operational during all flight operations. All this does is say you can, if you're going into one of these designated high risk areas, that you be visible on the equipment that should already be installed on these other aircraft.
Right. I'm not questioning the intent of the amendment. I'm questioning how it's drafted. And so, let me ask a question on that. Because what you're really saying is parts 91. So what this really says is parts 91 and 135 air tour operators that operate within high traffic air tour areas have to have ADSB out and in, and all other aircraft have to have out. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
That's not what this says. So I would suggest either clarifying that or having a separate recommendation focused just on that addition. I understand what you're trying to do, and I think it's a good addition. I just don't want FAA to receive this and be confused and say, oh, so there's a category of aircraft you mean to include just have out, but then later, 5 words later, it's in and out. It can be confusing. And so I'm just suggesting possibly we might consider breaking this out into 2 separate recommendations.
I'm open to whatever accomplishes the job.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
I'll defer to my attorney colleagues here and those who are experienced in drafting these kinds of things.
I've spent way too long drafting legislation.
I understand. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, we will more than likely, and I think I heard somebody say Mr. Chairman, and I don't know who that was, but
Yes, sir.
what I will suspect, yeah, just for planning, I suspect we're going to get a lot of input, then we will take a break so that this can be redrafted, and then we'll reconvene. Before we do that, though, I certainly want to hear from everybody, and I believe that was Member Chapman. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And I think we're on to something here that could work for me. I am sympathetic to the vice chairman's motivation here. I do have a concern about doing it in this recommendation. I think doing it a separate recommendation makes sense. And here's my concern. I worked to shape this language to include the reference to a special federal aviation regulation or other means, because I don't believe that an SFAR is the best means. I also don't think that the best approach here is to identify specific airspace areas, that a better approach is to have a general requirement that applies to the types of operators that we're targeting here, which are either Part 135 operators generally or commercial air tour operators. The concern I have about including this in this recommendation is that by necessity, you have to define specific areas of airspace. I think that's very problematic. I think it's going to be controversial. It's going to generate concerns from environmental, operational, sometimes cultural issues are impacted, where Native American communities are impacted, for example, or Civil War sites are impacted. I think when you get into trying to identify specific airspace related to air tours, you open up a kettle of fish that is going to be hard to manage. And I think it will slow this down in terms of trying to get where we want to be.
So, Mr. Chairman, a question. So how would you manage this so as not to require all Part 91 aircraft operating anywhere to equip with ADSB out, which was, of course, very carefully discussed and debated prior to the present regulation. This limits that area. And as far as additional involvement, I mean, the places where the air tour operators are flying, they're already doing it, whether it's Civil War battlefields or it's native lands or whatever. So it doesn't change the amount of traffic. What it has the potential to reduce the amount of traffic, because now you've got an additional piece of equipment required.
The problem, though, is in order to impose a requirement on Part 91 aircraft to be equipped in a specific way, you have to tell them in what airspace they have to have that equipment. And to do that, we're going to have to go around the country and identify all kinds of specific areas where this requirement will apply. I think that's going to be very cumbersome, very difficult, and probably very controversial.
Then you don't solve the problem.
I don't know exactly how to approach this in terms of getting where you want to go. I think where you want to go is the right answer, but we probably need some more discussion in terms of how to approach it in this report with respect to a recommendation. It may be that what we have to do is recommend to FAA that FAA study this in some fashion and come up with a proposal. I mean, if we can come up with some broad approach that captures these people, I think that's fine. I just don't know that identifying specific airspace is going to resolve this, because I think what ends up happening is basically nothing happens.
Well, if you go to a study, I think, and I'm reading my colleagues there. I'm sorry.
We'll take turns discussing. It should not be a conversation across the dais. So anyway, bottom line is, I do agree with Member Chapman that we are basically creating a new airspace requirement. And it's like having Class B airspace. In order to go in Class B airspace, you've got to have, I don't even know, you have a private pilot certificate, you got to have a transponder, you got to have a radio that has blah, blah, blah sorts of a number of frequencies and all this. And there's a list of requirements that you have to have. And so what we're doing is creating a new set of requirements for airspace. So I do agree, and I do agree fundamentally, Vice Chairman, with what you're saying, but I also agree with Member Chapman. And any other discussion before we turn to staff and get their viewpoint? Michael Graham, yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't see this amendment changing the recommendation. Really, we were already talking about identifying high traffic areas. And this addition, I see where the concern is with the vice chair, and I agree with it. What about everybody else running through there with their airplane? They're going to become a mid-air potential if they can't be seen, and we're going to continue to have mid-airs this way. I don't see this addition being any different than the original recommendation, but I am interested in what staff has to say.
Okay, let's go to staff first, and then we can come back to the members. So, Ms. Schultz, I would love to hear the viewpoint of staff.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the board. We actually share your concern, or your saw the challenges when we were drafting language initially, with the difference between looking at geographic areas versus operational types. And in fact, I think, as I understand what the Vice Chairman was going for here, and what I think the others have spoken about, is to make sure that these perhaps general aviation aircraft that may be going through these high density air tour areas are also broadcasting on ADSB out capability. So staff has no objection to that. That was our intent with referencing an SFAR as a mechanism. And we did that when we looked at the balance of trying to get something done that wouldn't have to go through protracted rulemaking potentially. And I say that noting that in prior investigations, we've seen the FAA respond to recommendations in some of these air tour areas based on accidents the board has investigated. So that was our best shot, but so we don't have any technical objection. We think that was the intent. So this change to be very specific, that, all aircraft at a minimum have to be broadcasting, have to have the ADSB out capability. That's what our intent was with mentioning the SFAR. So we think this would just amplify that.
I personally need a few minutes just to kind of study the issue, just to really look at it. I got this by the time I was able to get it printed. The board meeting had already started, and so I was not able to study it in detail. But what would be the viewpoints of the board? Would you like to take a recess so that we can hammer it out? Would you like to move on and have staff circulate something for our vote after the board meeting? What would be the sense of the board? I don't know if we can get there by hammering it out. Maybe we can, and if we can, I'd like to keep moving. What would be the sense of the board?
Well, since go ahead.
I recommend that we take a recess and see if staff can work out a reasonable, a good way to approach this issue that probably addresses everybody's concerns.
I think that'd be a nice way to do it. I mean, this is where we conduct our business, is in the open. We want to be transparent, and we want the public to see our deliberative process, and I think that's important. Vice Chairman, your thoughts?
I agree. I mean, I think everybody understands my motives, and then the question is how best to get there without unintended consequences, which of course we always want to avoid. But as I say, this is a significant hole here that I see, and I think we need to address it.
Great. I appreciate that very much. So here's what I'm going to propose. I'm going to propose that we take an hour. That will allow people to get something to eat. It will allow you, Vice Chairman, to coordinate with staff. I'd like for you to get on a phone call or a Teams call or a Zoom call or whatever it takes to coordinate with the Office of Aviation Safety staff. And if you will, kindly send back what you've got. The earlier the better, but I'd like to see if we could get that by by 2 o'clock so that we can study it. And then when we reconvene at 2:15, then we can be prepared to continue deliberation. Is that an acceptable solution to my colleagues on the board?
That works.
All right, great. So with that in mind, we're about to take a break. I'll invite all participants to turn off your cameras, turn off your microphones, and we are in recess for 1 hour. We will reconvene at 2:15 Eastern Time. We're in recess. We are back in session. That was a short 5 minutes that I said, but did everyone have a chance to review the email that Dana Schultz sent out?
Yes.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you. I had my speaker off. It went to sleep. But Vice Chairman, do you have, I'm going to turn the floor over to you because it looks like there may be some motions coming.
Right. So I'd like to withdraw my previous motion and propose a new motion. Does that sound like the right way to do this?
Yes, sir, I would say so.
Thank you, Ms. Silva. So I'd like to move that we add a recommendation number 2 that would read as follows. Further, the NTSB recommends that in high traffic air tour areas identified in recommendation 1 to require that all non-air tour aircraft operating within the airspace be equipped with ADSB out.
Vice Chairman, I apologize. For some reason, I think everyone else is able to hear you. Is that correct? Yeah, well, so it's on my end. Say something now.
Something? We can hear the guys in the background.
Yeah, it sounds good, doesn't it? That's the money. That's the sound of money being spent, but unfortunately. But I do apologize. I had a problem with my speaker, and I hate to make you repeat that. Have you made a? Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to make you.
I'll read it again. No problem. So I would like to move that we add a recommendation number 2, which reads as follows. Further, the NTSB recommends that in high traffic air tour areas, airspace, identified in recommendation 1, to require that all non-air tour aircraft operating within the airspace be equipped with ADSB out.
Okay, and from a process point of view, we already have a motion on the table, and you had a motion that had been seconded to amend finding number 1. I'm sorry, recommendation 1. Would you like to withdraw that motion?
Well, you missed that. I did ask to withdraw it prior to your technical problem.
Yeah, I don't know what the issue is, but it's on my end for sure. All right, so you made the motion, and I think Member Graham, you seconded his motion on number 1. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'll withdraw that.
Yeah, and so is everybody? Yeah. So you made the motion. Vice Chairman seconded. Member Graham seconded. You're willing to withdraw it, both of you. Okay. All right. So that motion is off the table. Now we've got your second motion, which is to what you've just stated. And is there a second?
Second.
Okay. So the Vice Chairman has made a motion. It's been seconded by Member Graham. Is there discussion? And there is. Vice Chairman, back to you. Or let's go to the Vice Chairman first, and then Member Hamidi, we'll call on you next.
I think the rationale remains as stated before the break, that there are other aircraft flying there that would essentially be invisible, regardless of how well equipped the commercial aircraft, air tour aircraft are. And so we really don't solve the problem here. And so we leave it to the FAA to figure out how best to set this up and to provide a better level of identification where it is desperately needed.
Thank you very much. Member Hamady.
Just for quick point of clarification, what you're doing is adding a new recommendation 2, but you're redesignating the existing recommendations 2 through 5 as 3 through 6?
That would be correct. That way we keep them in proximity, and that is what staff had recommended.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you weren't replacing the existing 2. Thank you.
Member Chapman.
Just a clarification, Vice Chairman, did you use the term air tour, high traffic air tour areas, or high traffic air tour airspace?
Let me find specifically. It should be air tour areas.
Areas, okay. That's helpful, thank you. And I would support this approach.
Okay, I was just looking at it one more time. And so, Member Graham, any comments from you, sir?
No, I'm okay with it. I'd be supportive of it.
Thank you very much. I'd sure like to hear from staff. Ms. Schultz, please go right ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Staff supports this. We have no objection. And in fact, as we had mentioned earlier, this was, I think, always our intent. So we think it's a good change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Vice Chairman, I'm going to get you to restate your motion. And since I was somewhere, they must have, I don't know. Anyway, I'll get you to restate your motion and then we'll take a vote if there's no further discussion.
Very good, sir. I would like to move to add a new recommendation number 2, which will renumber all subsequent recommendations. Further, the NTSB recommends that in high traffic air tour areas identified in recommendation 1 require that all non-air tour aircraft operating within the airspace be equipped with ADSB out.
Okay, there's the motion. It's been seconded. It's been moved and seconded to adopt Vice Chairman Landsberg's motion. Is there any further comment? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed to a vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg, your vote?
I vote aye.
Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The amendment has been adopted unanimously. Are there any further amendments to the recommendations? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the recommendations as revised, as we just revised it just then. I'll entertain such a motion.
I so move.
Okay, Member Hamady so moves, and it's been seconded by the Vice Chairman. Is there any discussion? All right, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the recommendations as revised. There's no further discussion. Vice Chairman Landsberg, your vote.
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The recommendations have been adopted unanimously as revised. So at this time, Mr. Curtis, if you would kindly read the reiterated recommendation, which is number 4.2, I believe.
Yes, sir. Staff additionally proposes reiterating the following safety recommendation in the report to the Federal Aviation Administration. Recommendation A1636. Require all 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators to establish safety management system programs.
Okay, so this would be the 6th time I believe we will have reiterated this recommendation since 2017. I believe that's pretty close. Obviously, the NTSB feels very much that this is important. Let's see, it's been reiterated 5 times. This would make it the 6th time since 2017, and it's on our most wanted list. I do not believe, and I could be totally wrong, we changed something about this about 6 months ago. I think since we've already voted on that recommendation and we're reiterating it, I don't think we need to take a vote specifically on that. However, when we vote for the entire report, that reiteration gets folded in there. Ms. Silbaugh, what is your viewpoint on that? I could be wrong on that.
No, sir, you're correct. That's the process.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate your keeping me in line. All right, so here's where we are. Let me get to where we are. Now we're to the point of the adoption of the final report due. Does anyone have any additional issues related to this report that they wish to discuss?
I do have one additional amendment to the report language, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, please.
This is modest and it complements the change to finding number 6, which we discussed earlier. This would be a change to page 57, lines 20 to 22. I circulated this language last night, although I apologize, we had a typo. It's page 57, lines 20 to 22, and that sentence would read as follows. I would amend it to read, one option available to FAA is its authority to establish special federal aviation regulations, or SFARs, for a finite period. Again, the purpose of this is to clarify that an SFAR is one means, but not the only means for accomplishing this ADSB equipment requirement.
Okay, that's Member Chapman's motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Member Hamidi seconds, and the truth is this makes that statement consistent with the recommendations that we just adopted, so that we're not absolutely zeroing in on the SFAR for the way to move forward. Is there any discussion from the board members related to this? Okay, certainly would like to hear from staff. Ms. Schultz, what does staff believe on this one?
Thank you, Chairman. We're in agreement with this. And also, if I would add, I failed to mention on the prior motion and the adoption of the new rec number 2 that staff will provide a page change to incorporate that into the final report.
I see. Okay. All right, good. So you'll circulate that page change for a after board meeting vote on those changes.
Yes, sir. I believe that's the procedure, and I'll just ask General Counsel Kathy Silbaugh to confirm that for me.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
And as I've said before, Ms. Schultz, in a modal directors meeting, I think the board members would prefer just to see the changed page instead of the entire report, so that we don't have to thumb through the entire report. Is that the consensus of the board? You'd just like to see that page in the context of the report? That's the way we used to do it. I have noticed lately they have been putting out the last 2 times they've put out the entire report. You've got to scroll through the entire report to see where the change is made. But Member Hamidi, any thoughts on that? Oh, okay, thanks. I thought you were looking like you wanted to speak. Also, so there's a motion on the table to modify page 51 as presented, I'm sorry, 57 as presented by Member Chapman. It's been seconded. Is there any further discussion? Okay, we'll proceed to a vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamidi.
Aye.
Member Hamidi votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. That amendment has been made, has been adopted unanimously. There's also one other thing as we're related to the report. I don't think this requires a vote, but we can certainly do it. I want you to notice that on page 62, there's footnote 74. And that verbiage says, the pilot's tablet was destroyed during the accident, therefore no information was available regarding whether the pilot was using it or how the ForeFlight application was configured. Information recorded on the pilot's online ForeFlight account did not contain any relevant information about the application setting. I think that in talking to staff yesterday, I had missed that nuance there. I do read footnotes, but because it was a footnote, I probably didn't pay as much of attention to it. I'm going to propose, and we can vote on it or we can just agree to it. It could probably be done editorial, but that's up to us to decide. I'm going to propose that verbiage just be moved up into the main body of the report. Would anybody object to that? And if you do, we can certainly take a vote on it. But I think staff indicated that since the verbiage was already there, it's just a matter of moving it up. But would anybody object to that?
No,
I see no objections. And Ms. Silbaud, your feeling on that?
Yes, that's fine. There's no change to the language, so that's perfectly fine.
Okay, great.
Do not need a vote.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Any other comments regarding the report before we move to the final adoption of the report? All right. Is there a motion to adopt the report as revised?
So moved.
Vice Chairman Landsberg has moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Member Chapman has seconded. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion regarding the motion to adopt the final report as revised? Okay, seeing none. Vice Chairman Landsberg?
Aye.
Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. And Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The report of this tragic event has been adopted as revised unanimously. So as we wrap it up, do any members wish to file a concurring or dissenting statement?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Member Chapman reserves the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement. I also reserve the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement. Mine will certainly be a concurring statement. We'll probably want to elaborate on the importance of SMS. So, as we wrap it up, anyone participating in the board meeting may welcome you to turn off your mics and your cameras. And in closing, I want to thank my colleagues on the board for their preparation going into the board meeting and for the good discussion and the good debate. I always feel like we get a better product as a result of getting various viewpoints and getting these deliberations out in the open. My special thanks to Member Hamady for serving as the board member on scene. And thanks to the investigative staff in the Office of Safety, Office of Aviation Safety, and certainly the Office of Research and Engineering. I always say, though, that nothing at the board gets done by just one person or one department. It takes an entire organization to be able to get these investigations completed and to be able to conduct a board meeting. So thank you, a sincere thank you, not only to the investigative staff, but to the program and the support staff for helping to bring it all together. Today, we've discussed the inherent limitations of see and avoid concept, and among other improvements, the recommendations that we issue today, the newly issued recommendations, if acted upon, and there's the key right there, if acted upon, result in an FAA requirement to augment see and avoid with ADSB out and in for all Part 91 and Part 135 air tour operations in high traffic tour areas. And as you see, we just amended that to include all aircraft that would be operating in those areas to have at least ADSB out. They'll also require such systems in Part 135 operations and result in better awareness of the limitations of see and avoid and ways to counter these limitations. And finally, these recommendations, if implemented, even though we've reiterated now, I think 6 times, they will result in safety management systems for all Part 135 operations. An SMS might have provided TOC-1 Air an opportunity to discover and mitigate the risk introduced by the changes to the Capstone affiliated avionics in its aircraft. Other Capstone operators were also affected by the avionics upgrade, and the chances of finding and mitigating this risk would improve with each participant that was regularly and methodically exercising safety management principles. Even if one operator missed the rest, others might have caught it. But don't stop there. SMSs are programs that hunt for risk, what other risk they might therefore find and mitigate through intentional safety risk management, rather than literally mitigating something by accident. When we placed SMS, requiring SMS on our most wanted list, and we did that 2 weeks ago, we knew that the FAA administrator has reported a plan to publish a proposed SMS rule in fall of 2022. This plan holds that promise, but the final rule will reveal whether that promise is kept. And believe me, we will be watching. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.